Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, Ross. Zodiac Files, the interview series. You've seen them both on the series before. Fresh off of the Peacock documentary, Myth of the Zodiac, Professor Thomas Henry Horan, Rich Grinell, ZodiacCiphers.com. Basically a power panel. These guys have never spoken before that I know of, so we're going to get everything out from them, cover the doc, and feel free to hit us up in the chat. Although if your questions are ludicrous, we'll be skipping them. Prof, how you feeling?
I'm fantastic, Ross. Thank you so much for having me back. We had such a great chat the last time, and I've been dying to talk to Richard, so thank you so much.
Yep. Rich, welcome back.
Hi, Ross. How are you?
Great, man. Good to have you back.
It's been a lot of developments today, hasn't there, with the Long Island serial killer?
Yeah, no, there's been a lot. I mean, there's that too. And then obviously, Rich, you've had some new articles on your site, which have kind of covered the news. So I didn't even have this written down. But before we get into myth and the recent Zodiac news, Prof, I'm just wondering, what do you make of this thing about Lindsay Robbins saying it was his dad who lifted up Paul Stein's body and left the bloody fingerprints on the Stein cab? I think you have an article on this on your site, Rich.
No, I haven't written about it. Because frankly, I don't buy it.
Yeah, we got Rich's reaction there, but we could deep dive that. Let's get it to you, Tom, because this kind of falls into your wheelhouse.
Who is this person?
So the kids, the Robin kids who witnessed, in my opinion, Zodiac at the Presidio Heights. You have your own suspect. He makes this argument. Like, okay, this is what I don't get about the story, right? It's plausible that he goes down there and tries to lift up Paul Stein to help him and rests his hand on the cab and leaves the bloody fingerprints here. But this is the thing. Are you going to go up to, even in 69, are you going to go up to a body laying on the ground with his head blown off, clearly in a pool of blood, and say, hey, man, are you okay? Can I help you up? You know what I mean? Wouldn't you expect if the person was still conscious, they would answer you verbally before you tried lifting? That's my only issue with the thing, you know?
The problem with Lindsay is the stories have grown taller over the years. There's also a story that when Lindsay saw the first patrol car pull up, Pelistetti and Peta, who they're the ones mentioned in the Zodiac letter, not Falcon's Elms. Anyway, he said he ran downstairs and yelled at Pelistetti, there he goes. You could still see him walking up the street. Like the timing was that close. Now that's what Lindsay told Mike Rodelli. Back 20 some odd years ago. Now we showed Lindsay the mugshots of my suspect for the Stein shooting. Could it be this guy? And Lindsay said, I honestly just don't remember what the face looks like anymore. I've looked at that sketch for so many years. That's all I see.
Yeah.
So, but as far as going down and handling the body, I don't believe that. I think this is the problem of talking to witnesses 30 or 40 years later, even cops. Cops in the documentary remember things that they wrote down differently in their reports.
I totally agree with that point, and you guys deep dive that in the doc. But you know, his story was that his dad told him, or I guess it was Lindsay Robinson's son in this case, that his dad told him that don't announce this story until I pass, or until however many family members passed, or whatever. So that again, that's the story that was.
But the true story is the one where the sketch was published in the paper and the kid said, no, that's not quite right. So the dad, Mr. Robinson, called the newspaper and the newspaper called the police. And that's why those two detectives from the Zebra Squad, they worked the zebra killings. They took the sketch artist back, not Armstrong or Toschi. This was two different detectives. They went back and they revised the sketch. They add the blotches. They add the scars.
The widows. Wait, hold on. Scars. Those are age lines.
No. Not on the forehead. The scars on the side of the neck.
Oh,
nobody ever sees. Nobody ever sees those. And he's got blotches because there's that type of paper he used. He could erase and leave blotches, which were on all down the cheeks and down the side and down side of the neck, and scars where the guy had scar removal surgery. I know all about this stuff. So anyway, they said they saw the sketch and they said, that's not quite right, and added the widow's peak. And it's interesting.
I was going to say that.
And it's interesting that Pellisetti's written description of the suspect doesn't even mention the scars. And then you find out who Pellisetti really was and what he really did at San Francisco Police Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He actually incriminates himself for being somebody who could have taken a piece of Paul Stein's shirt, because he talks about being alone with the body while Peta is canvassing the neighborhood. So he could have done it. He could have easily done it. So that's and of course the documentary only had, it's about 3 hours of TV time to squeeze, they barely scratched the surface, and they just had, but by following up on the book, they had uncovered all this new stuff and got people to talk who had never talked. Linda Jensen had never talked. That story is fascinating. Richard, you haven't seen it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I don't know if he just revealed that for you, Richard. The three college girls at Berryessa, they finally got one of them on camera to.
Yeah, I heard about the Linda. Yeah.
What
I was going to say about the Robbins kids made a statement many years ago, and they claimed that the Zodiac, or the killer, let's say, tried to lever Paul Stein up into an upright position. Now, usually you might ignore this being a later statement, but that tallies perfectly with the right-handed fingerprints found on the dividing panel between the driver's side door and the rear door, which seems to tell.
No, Richard, you see what's happened? You have fallen for the hoax. They did not find any fingerprints on the post between the doors. They found fingerprints of a hand that had opened the driver's side door, apparently, and had gripped the window frame. The window was rolled down. There were no fingerprints on that dividing panel.
There's a picture of the prints on the dividing panel that you can actually go and view.
I've heard both. So I thought the bloody fingerprints,
and they're not bloody. They're not bloody fingerprints. It says
fingerprints in blood.
No. It says very clearly in the report, the blood droplets, tiny blood droplets, had already settled on the door frame before the fingerprints went over them. They weren't bloody fingerprints. That's a story that Paul Avery came up with, but it's not in the reports. It's not in the reports.
What about the fingerprints on the passenger side door handle?
That's what I was getting to. That's supposed to be bloody. Yeah.
This doesn't make sense with the kids. If they saw.
Now, that obviously could have been Pellisetti. It could have been the ambulance crew.
Yeah, the EMTs. There's time with basically Tom getting a bunch of time in between.
The kids said they saw him. It looked like he was wiping down those 3 door handles. So it must have been somebody after the killer left, which could have been Pellisetti, because he said he checked. Somebody opened that door and turned the body over. Because when Pellisetti arrived at the scene, the door is closed and the head is lying on the floorboard. But when you look at the photos taken by the newspaper reporter, the door is open and he's rotated back up on the seat with his hands hanging out and his head hanging out. That's not how he was when Pellisetti.
That's not how he was left. That's how he was manhandled by the ambulance crew when they arrived.
Right.
Yeah, she said.
Well, that's easy to prove, because if you look at the 2 pictures of him hanging out the door, one picture there's absolutely no blood on the floor, and in the second picture there's tons of blood on the floor. Now, if he was actually in that position when, say, the Zodiac or the killer left, you wouldn't have that first picture. So it's, he was pulled out into that position by the ambulance crew, and the police report actually stated his head was in the footwell of the passenger side. But what we do know, if you look at the blood pattern on Paul Stein's shirt, the right side is heavily bloodstained down the front, but the left side goes to at least 2/3 distance. So we know for a fact when Paul Stein was shot, he didn't fall into the footwell, because there's no way that could produce that blood pattern on the left side. He must have been upright for a certain time. That seems to tally with the kids pulling him upright at some point, or he stayed upright for a certain time until the killer went from the rear to the front and then pulled him down. But he couldn't have fell immediately to the right on being shot.
So this is where I'd like to introduce Drew's theory, because people have gone back and forth. Not Drew, I think it's Tony's theory. But the Halloween card with the skeleton with his arms up being how, like, supposedly in the position of how Paul Stein's body was found. However, if the killer dips before the body's changed to that position, how would he know? You know what I mean? But I'm
he
sure
wouldn't know. He'd have been gone.
Right.
Paul Stein would never have been in that position.
Exactly, right.
In the paper, yeah.
Right.
Unless we go with one of Tom's things of that they have inside information or access to the police files or whatever.
But we can fall back on that all the time with everything, can't we? We could just say it's inside info.
There you go, Tom.
No. It's actually in the letters. The information that's actually in the letters that the killer couldn't possibly have known. Now,
like what?
But apart from that, let's get back to the cab. Yeah. What Ross brought up was a murder of a cab driver down by Los Angeles near Camp Pendleton earlier in the 60s, where the killer did scoot the driver over, get in the cab, and drive the cab another block.
No scooting the driver.
He pulled him out.
Yes. So Rich probably knows Ray Davis. So he pulled him out by his belt loops, Tom, and dumped him between the houses, and then drove the cab up the alley.
Then drove the cab over. But Richard might be right. There might have been some monkeying around with the position of the body besides just pulling him over to go through his pockets. Like he might have been trying to stage some type of scene so people wouldn't call the cops or something. You're right about that. He's right. And then he gets out and he goes and he opens up the front passenger door and reaches in and pulls him over. He doesn't sit in the front passenger seat and pull him over. He just pulls him over, leans over the body, goes through his pockets, tears off a piece of the shirt, apparently, tries to wipe off the... Now, if he left bloody fingerprints on the door handle, he might not have been able to wipe them off. Blood is very sticky. And a small amount of blood would have maybe been impossible to wipe off. Maybe they did find some fingerprints on the front passenger door handle.
Well, you said that they saw him wipe off 3. So if there's a 4th one, did he miss one? And also, this is what I don't get about the Robbins kids recantation of the story. Like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Rich, but they said like they saw him with Stein's head in his lap cutting the shirt. What would he need Stein's head in his lap for to cut the shirt?
Yeah, ahead, I mean, they viewed that from about
super far. I've been there. Yeah,
there's no way a killer, knowing he hasn't got a vehicle, that's going to walk away on foot, who's just shot a guy in their head, who's bleeding profusely, is going to put the guy's head in his lap. That's
what I'm getting at. That's what I was getting at. Yeah,
now
that doesn't make any sense.
That's a interpretation. His head was in the footwell, and he was probably leaning over him. There was no need for ever to get any blood on him.
Exactly.
Right. The story about him, that's out of Graysmith's book. He claims that that's what the kids told him, right? That's not in the original
as well. It's in the police report.
Let me pull it up. You guys talk about that.
So it's probably what we say.
We interpretation, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
If his head was in the footwell and the killer was leaning over the top on the passenger side, tearing a bit of shirt, as they claim, I think it was cut, but there you go. There's no way on earth that you can't take that as gospel, because they're a distance away. If they're on the level, you can't really see that below the door line. If they're above, up in the 3rd flight, 50 feet away, that's really difficult to interpret. So I would take that with a big pinch of salt, because the Zodiac may have had social issues, but he certainly wasn't stupid.
Yeah, right. I think it was cut too. And then the cherry on top of why I don't understand that, if Falk and Zelms do see him, I don't really buy like the foggy Presidio Park excuse that you can't see the blood on his pants, because like, dude, if the headlights are shining on him, I don't care how foggy it is, you should be able to see something, right? So
there's no need for him to have blood on him at all. He might have a bit from the back spatter when he shot him. He may have a little bit on his hands, but he had a handkerchief or the shirt piece. He could have easily wiped that off. The only blood he ever needed to be on him was on his hands, which he could have wiped off. The idea that it'd be splattered in blood is nonsense.
I agree.
You're right. They did put that in the report that they saw him, but I agree with Richard. Also, how is he? I don't know if you guys have ever handled dead bodies, but the phrase dead weight actually means something. Yeah. I don't think you could lift Paul Stein off your lap and get out of the car. Like, it would just be a stupid thing for the killer to do. But it's obvious that Falk just assumed that the Zodiac letter was talking about him. I don't think it is. It's obviously talking about Pelicetti and Peta, and that was something Mike Rodelli had pieced together, which I think he's right about. The Zodiac did not, the killer did not encounter Falcon Zelms. The killer encountered Pelicetti and Peta, and that's why he's calling attention. And then the thing he didn't think of, I happen to know goof is underworld slang for a corpse. 2 cops pulled a goof. Well, the 2 cops who helped remove the body from the cab, who I say could have helped themselves to a piece of shirt, that all fits together. And Richard's right. It doesn't make any sense physically for him to have the victim over in his lap.
And just for comparison for my series, the Zodiac Files on YouTube, guys, like, subscribe, share. If we are saying Davis is the Zodiac, if he grabs the belt loop and dumps Davis that time, why is he going to switch it up on Stein and throw the head in his lap unnecessarily? It makes 0 sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the Ray Davis case is interesting. The threat part of it is interesting. I don't think cab shootings are that infrequent, are they? So there was plenty of taxi cab shootings, and that did vary wildly from the Paul Stein murder. But then again, I don't dismiss the idea that the threats before and later were very interesting aspects of the crime.
100%. And then what they introduced in the myth of the Zodiac, and I believe you mentioned it in the book, Tom, is that there's this rash of cabbie robberies before Stein. And to quote Tom's favorite source, Graysmith, in Zodiac, he says that that Stein is robbed by 2 people before the murder. So he essentially insinuates that was a dry run for Stein's murder later on, which it doesn't really make any sense to me, but it's all in there. You guys can come up with your own.
And there was the murder of that Larry Hargis, wasn't there, in San Diego?
Yeah.
Yep.
That was the day before the Button letter.
Well, the funny thing
is, that's interesting.
The funny thing is, the MO of the taxi cab bandit is identical. He hails a cab on Nob Hill in front of a restaurant or hotel, and he asks for an address in Presidio Heights. And when they get there, he robs them. Now, the description of that guy happens to match the description of George Waters, an early suspect in the Darlene Ferrin murder. But that doesn't prove that it's him. But the description, he's described as half American, half Asian, and probably a war baby, and that's how he's described. So it doesn't really fit the killer of the Stein case. But George Waters is not a bad suspect for the Stein murder, in addition to not being that bad of a suspect for the Darlene Ferrin murder, and he does match the description of the taxi cab bandit. So
yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on there. So I'm gonna just reset us. Debunking Graysmith, which is what Thomas Henry Horan does in this. He really lights up Graysmith in here, Rich. So I'm sure you picked up on that. Let's just get your response.
I did read it about 9 years ago because it came out in 2012, I think, didn't it?
Yeah.
Have you read the whole thing? All 3 parts?
Yeah.
All 3 parts? Or just a little?
The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, 1986. Or no, Myth of the Zodiac Killer, the one that was released. What was it? July 19th, 2012.
Oh, you haven't really read any of it. Like, you haven't read the whole book. You added parts 2 and 3. What I did was for reasons. Oh, and there's even part 1.
But I have read your blog pages.
Sorry, Richard. Yeah, that was a long time ago.
I know
that was a long time ago. So there's a lot more has come to light since then. I will see to it you get a copy of the book.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So that's not going to be fair, but we'll go through this. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a bunch of notes, Tom. As you know, I just got to part 3, so I really wanted to get into like your Hal Snook stuff because I don't know anything about Hal Snook. But so Tom, you smoked Graysmith in this. You went in on him. Okay, I agree with most of it. I agree with almost all of it. Now, what you did the best job of is what I call Zodiac World, all the surrounding events outside of the so-called Zodiac murders, in Tom's opinion. The backgrounds of the people, the biker gangs, the crime. I agree with all that. Even the vigilante journalism stuff that you talk about, and the tabloid papers. And I essentially agree with all of this. Now, as I told you before, when I first heard about your theory, I did not like it at all. I thought it was ludicrous. Then Ned and Drew kept talking about it. So I'm like, why are guys as smart as Ned and Drew keep talking about this hoax theory? So what I would say to most people is, like, you guys have a tendency to write off the theory without, I would definitely say read Tom's book, or at least watch the documentary and see what you think at that point. Because most of the stuff you say about Graysmith is right, but you keep coming back to him working in the dark room, having access to the camera, and therefore you're like insinuating that he would be involved with the letter writing. So
he does.
I'm not disputing that he has access to that stuff. I agree with you that he does, but I don't. Is that a jump to what you're accusing him of, though, Tom? It's like I gotta do Evil's. Well, you walk right up to the accusal. You walk right up to the accusal, Tom.
No. I don't accuse him of participating in actually helping to fake the letters. I do point out that his own book, when he comes up with this detailed profile of the Zodiac, it fits Graysmith 100%. And I think he does that to kind of rub it in people's faces. But as far as being an active participant in the hoax, I never claim I can prove that. I only claim that his book, Zodiac, is a hoax, because he did have access to those exact same files that I used, but he goes through and lies about what they say.
No, okay, that's correct. Okay, so what you said about his original manuscript focusing on, William Joseph Grant?
Apparently,
and then, so this is what you got him on. When he rechanges it, because you said his first deal got dropped, so he rechanges it. He changes it to Bob Hall Star. I can't even remember which aliases he used, but the Arthur Lee Allen alias. And then he keeps a bunch of those suspect descriptions the same as the original manuscript, and he muddies the water. So that was an amazing point out by you. You definitely got him on that. I agree. You definitely got him on that. However, as for everything else, Tom, though, like you keep, like, I don't know. I'm having a tough time buying that it's like the Avery angle makes more sense because he has the media, motive for doing it, right? But for Graysmith, I just don't see, like, his book being a hoax. Yes, absolutely, because he makes up a lot of stuff. But as far as you keep coming back to him in the dark room and having access to the, it's more prevalent in the Tashi
shirt.
Not just that. Yeah. It's more prevalent in the Tashi Dick Tracy theory of the Scorpio character. You guys were saying that only someone who would have had access to the comic strip before it was published would know the connection. And while it's possible, because Graysmith is a cartoonist, I don't know. That one didn't really seem to add up.
No. He wasn't just a cartoonist. He did all of the production work. So
the photography,
So he had access, and like he says in his it's Graysmith who says Zodiac may have had sneak peeks. Well, Graysmith did, because he was the one who assembled those pages in the darkroom.
What do you think, Rich? Are you following me here? Because we got a whole
this book.
Well, essentially, like, Tom is saying that, like, Graysmith has access to, like, a lot of this stuff before it goes public, and that can be a resource for information that is relayed in the Zodiac letters. If I'm misconstruing it, Tom, correct me.
All I would say is, if he has got access to all this information, we still can't prove he has anything to do with it.
Well,
agreed.
Right. The thing that Ross is bringing up is, in Graysmith's book, Richard, he has this detailed profile of the Zodiac. He has access to darkroom equipment. He has skills. Well, that describes Graysmith.
Yeah, it all applies to himself, which, I mean, that's like a Freudian slip, though.
Cartoonist. He wasn't just a cartoonist. He did all the darkroom work at the Chronicle, which is a union shop, by the way. And before he did it at the Chronicle, he did it at the Oakland Tribune. That's where he met Bob Pop. And before he did it at the Oakland Tribune, he did it at the Tachikawa Marauder since he was 12 years old. He's been working in the darkroom production department of newspapers. So he knew all about that stuff. And he did fake at least one Zodiac letter The Paul Stein letter, the version that's published in the paper, that graphic, that's not the original letter. That's a tracing.
Which one are you on about?
And the person, the one when he said, "I'm the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington and Maple."
But that
when you
had the shirt piece in.
Right, but when you look at the Chronicle, when you look at the graphic of that letter in the Chronicle, that's not a photograph of the actual letter. That's a traced version of the letter done by Graysmith. Apparently using the technique that he said he used. There's no one else. Who else at the Chronicle?
Well, it could be a third generation copy. It doesn't have to.
No.
Not necessarily the original.
If you just lay one on top of the other, there's no way it's a copy of the original. Someone has traced it. And I think it's because the cops told them, don't be publishing this in the paper, so they published a facsimile. So we know that Graysmith did at least once fake a Zodiac letter for the newspaper. What would stop him from doing it again 2 years later or 8 years later? There's nothing to stop him to publicize his book.
I mean, it's interesting. You got to reel him in, Rich. You got to reel him in.
No, I was just going to say, I've seen letters. For example, the Fairfield letter. You see the one in the FBI files, the one that's been released, and you compare the ones in the FBI files where they're comparing handwriting from the original, and you compare that Fairfield letter to the multiple copied one that's been released. Some of the letters don't even look the same. So they've obviously been distorted at some point through reproduction. I don't know about the Stein letter. I've always just looked at that in the newspaper and took it to be the original that's just been copied. But
no, And the full letter is. So here's the problem. You're at a disadvantage. You thought you had read my book, but you haven't. So I will get you a copy of the book because I have not only.
He's going to say that a lot, Rich.
I've not only deduced who wrote the original letters, but his handwriting really is a perfect match.
So you're claiming he wrote the October the 13th letter?
No. The version that was published in the Chronicle was a copy that was hand drawn by Graysmith.
But what was the purpose of that?
The
cops told him not to publish the authentic.
I think the cops told him not to publish the actual authentic letter. So Graysmith cooked up a facsimile, but we know he had practice doing it, and he had practice doing it using the techniques that he himself describes in his book that the Zodiac probably used. That doesn't mean I'm not accusing Graysmith of writing the original letters. I'm accusing a cop who had access
keeping it going.
Yeah, and later on, Graysmith, Avery, Don Chaney, they keep it going by writing more phony letters. But the original letters, I've identified a different suspect for writing.
I have a theory about a writing team that I want to propose to you guys, slightly altered for that. But okay, so Horan goes in on Graysmith in here. I agree with most of it, but as far as him changing his name from Robert Gray Jr. to Graysmith, you keep coming back to that and roasting it for him in the book. So what is the significance, Tom? You're trying to say that he's hiding his past so he doesn't get identified for these things that he's describing that fall in line with what's going on?
Well, first of all, if you're going to call yourself an investigative journalist, you're not supposed to use a pen name. There goes your credibility. But mainly, he makes a big deal out of these 13 leftover letters in the original 408 cipher. He says maybe it's an anagram, and he comes up with the solution. Robert Emmett the hippie.
It was garbage.
Well, there's a much better solution, and the much better solution is Robert P. Smith II.
Yeah, I saw it in there. You have it in there.
And that's Robert Graysmith's real name. His real name is Robert G. Smith II. And I just thought it was funny that Graysmith didn't notice that his own name was a possible solution.
But can't you put Drew Beeson in there? So Rich, any significance of Robert Smith's real name in the cipher?
No, because I believe it's just filler, and the reason I believe it is because in the decoded thing, it read, "and all the I have killed." Mm-hmm. Now, clearly, he's accidentally missed something from draft to main production, let's say.
Or intentionally.
And I initially thought it was people, because he uses people 6 times when he writes those initial 3 letters. But you'll find that 3 lines begin with E. So if he's going from one side to another in the written message, 3 lines begin with E. What he's done is mistaken and accidentally missed out 1 line. And the real message, I believe, should have been, and all the lone or stray people that I have killed. That fills in that line. It leaves 1 available decoded letter at the end, which is, I think, an E. And if you put that back in the decoding process, I'm not saying this is the answer,
right?
But it leaves 1 letter at the end. Now, for people who like the Sherry Joe Bates thing with the Z, if you put that E that's left over at the end, that E is decoded to Z. That's a curious element of that. But I believe he just missed all the lone or stray people.
But here's the...
Because that's what he wrote in his 3 letters. I'm going to target lone or stray people in the night.
But he doesn't really target any lone people.
How about the missing word is victims? Because he uses the word victims a lot, but he doesn't use it anywhere in the 408. So I thought maybe victims, the victims.
Whether it was people or lone or stray people, the intention was never to leave 18 unsolved letters at the end. Or
oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, what I'm saying is nobody writes all that I have killed. He's obviously missed something out there, whatever it is.
Agreed.
So the original intention was never to put Robert Emmett the hippie in.
Yeah, right. No, he spelled well. Then there's the that Herb Cain thing that Graysmith did, which was atrocious when he thought he solved the cipher. It was absolutely hilarious.
Speaking of somebody who wrote phony letters to himself at the Chronicle and won a Pulitzer Prize doing it, that was Herb Cain.
Interesting. So victims, he spells wrong, victims, and then you have don't you have Cheney writing the thing to Voight where he spells victims weird again? So just throwing that in there.
Well, here's an interesting thing. When do you think the Bates letter? Now, I know people don't think they're real, but that's not necessarily true because the DNA wasn't compared from the 2016 hoaxer to thing. That's been misinterpreted. Right. So we don't know that was written by a hoaxer. That could still be written by the same person who wrote the confession letter.
Maybe. Even still, though, it doesn't do anything for me. I thought you were with me on Bates, Rich. I thought you didn't think it was Z.
No, I don't. But I was just postulating the idea. But
I'm still open. I'm still open to the letters, mind you.
But what I'm asking you is, when we know on November the 16th, Paul Avery released the article about the Bates letters. Yeah. Now, from what I can gather, that's the first time those letters were revealed with a Z. Mm-hmm. Is that? Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Those Bates letters were never revealed to the public till Avery released them on November the 16th, 1970. Yes.
Right.
So isn't it funny, don't you think, that in the little list letter he spelt victim, just like the confession letter. Mm-hmm. He then released the Halloween card, and for the first time ever used the letter Z. And then a month later, well, not even a month later, you've got this Paul Avery releasing the thing about the Sherry Joe Bates murder when she was found on Halloween card, the letter Z, and victim was in the previous letter, the little less letter. So my argument has always been he read the details about the Sherry Joe Bates case and was trying to push them detectives into making this connection, which obviously Phil Sins did.
Absolutely. But here's my thing. So Arthur Lee Allen goes to the race in Riverside, right? Yeah. So he calls out to work the next day. You think that a bunch of 18-year-old college kids aren't going to notice Arthur Lee Allen's huge, fat, bald ass in that teeny tiny library if the story plays out the way it says in the confession letter that I went in after I disconnected the distribute wire with grease all over my hands and stood around for everybody to see me? However, if you have Allen and Cheney collaborating on writers, such as Drew's theory, you could have Cheney have Allen drop off that confession letter because it was local correspondence when it went to Press Enterprise. And that's the best I can do with Bates, because I don't really see any of the Zodiac suspects standing outside the library waiting for Sherry. I just don't, and I have this the first time I've announced that publicly.
There's one. I just brought it up last week on my show. Now, Richard, that's not that's apparently not a letter Z, a letter Z.
No, I know, but
it's a stylized.
People interpret it as a Z.
Well,
right.
Right. Oh, well, that's a very good point
not,
because it's a Japanese hiragana character, and that the typed letter was not typed on just any portable Royal typewriter. It was typed on a Royal that was made specifically for the Japanese journalism market. It had both capital Roman letters and it had Japanese hiragana characters. And that symbol was apparently the shift key that would switch from English to Japanese characters. And so
I like that angle.
I don't know what that proves, but I think Richard might be right. Somebody saw the Z and got big ideas, because I'm way behind on Drew's work on Avery and Cheney, but I think it fits in.
He's good on that.
With what we're doing, because
he's real good on that. Yeah, I could agree. Here's the problem. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, the newspapers put Z. They didn't say, "Oh, it looked like a stylized Z." So all I'm saying is the reader of that, when he mailed a Halloween card, could have been just interpreting it as that.
Right, exactly. Now, Richard, here's what I was dying to ask you about. I read it once on your website and I couldn't find it again. You are the one who sat down and
you did the verbiage comparison.
About the attempted DNA testing on Zodiac letters, you deduced which ones they found cells, saliva in, and which ones they didn't. You know that lines up with my pointing out changes in the handwriting and personality, right?
Yeah. Well, I do know what you mean, because I did point out that the cells, there was few cells and some cells. Oh, no, what was it? Cells found and few cells.
Right.
And I noticed there was a shift in the Mikado letters, the Kathleen John's letter, the Little List letter, and the Exorcist letter. There was more cells found on those than the others.
Right. And the officer giving the briefing said that on the authentic Zodiac letters, we didn't really find any cells because they weren't licked. And on the other letters, we found cells because they were licked. Like the police deduced that he starts off by licking the envelopes and stamps, but no, by not licking them. And then suddenly he starts licking them. And I show that there's a distinct change in the handwriting. Like he even stops turning the paper upside down. It's that big of a change. So I thought that, but I couldn't find that actual page on your website.
No, because I've deleted it because I disagree with it now.
You were right. You were absolutely right.
No, I don't think I was, because few cells and some cells is ambiguous. You know, you can't really interpret it with any, confidence. And also, I believe obviously the Zodiac was still writing probably up to 1990, and therefore I agree. That theory I once had, I've just dismissed now, because that DNA chart is less than clear. All we do know is that they said DNA was found on the 78 letter. And because I've shown now with the envelopes that you can prove the 78 letter is genuine. No, sorry. The Exis letter you can prove is genuine because I don't know if you read it, but only 2 letters were ever addressed on the because a lot of the envelopes were not released to the public.
Right.
And only 2 letters had San Fran Chronicle. And they were the April letters in 1970. And if you look at the dragon card envelope, and I'm not a fan of handwriting, but when something hasn't been released, you compare that dragon card envelope with the Exorcist envelope and put it alongside each other. It is literally identical. And there's no way a hoaxer could just pull that out of thin air, because the only envelope he had available to him was the November the 8th dripping pen card.
And
that was addressed like that.
Speaking of the Exorcist letter, well, Richard, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it was a prank or a joke. This is it's actually much more serious and much more complicated. Speaking of the Exorcist letter, that letter is more in Hal Snook's natural handwriting. And it's exactly the kind of letters to the editor he would write under his own name. That's the kind of letters he would write to the. He used to be a newspaper editor, and he would write these really kind of cold, acid, sarcastic letters to the editors, just like the Zodiac, just like the. So he may not have even been trying to pass it off as a Zodiac letter. He may have just been writing one of his normal letters to the editor that he liked to write.
Here's my thing, Tom. What point do you have Snook taking over the letter writing? Is it after Stein?
No. He writes the first letters. He writes the three the 3 letters that go with the 3 pieces of 408. Then he writes the letter on Saturday, August 4th. Then there's a difference of opinion. I think handwriting and things are still pretty much the same in the Stein letter. However, the linguists thought that there's a change, and other handwriting people think they see a change with the Exorcist letter, or with the Stein letter.
Let's give Rich the update. So in Myth of the Zodiac episode 2, Rich, Andrew Knox was the producer? Yeah. They hire an AI firm, Rich, to analyze.
Yeah.
Have you heard about this, though? You've seen the articles. So here's the only problem, Tom. Using 23 things of correspondence, because it looks like they had the Sherry desk poem in there. Most of us think that has probably nothing to do with Zodiac, so I really don't see any point in analyzing that one. But that aside, they say that the verbiage and the use of small words after a certain point after Stein points to the letter writer changing. So here's my problem with the whole thing, Tom, is you're putting the Mikado and the Tim Holt references, the by knife, by gun, by fire, by rope, the comic book references, the movie references, the Badlands. You're saying that's all Avery and Cheedy and Graysmith, because in my opinion, it would almost be difficult for that many people to link up this many references, which clearly show a personality that's a comic book reader, that's a fan of plays, that's a fan of reading books like The Most Dangerous Game and the ABC Murders. I just have a the personality looks like it's one person. I'm not saying it is one person, but I don't see how multiple different people can okay, I'm just going to randomly pick the lady of whatever it's called, Wheel of Death, randomly and reference that. You know what I mean? It just seems too random to not be
there you go.
Concentrated.
There you go. I'm not saying the letters were some kind of cheap joke. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that when you realize who the victims really were and who their parents really were, there are very strong links between the Bates murder and the Farron murder. But that's not in my book, because that shows up in future research. There is actually a very close link between Jim Crabtree and Sherry Jo Bates.
What letters are you claiming that Hal Snook wrote?
So just the first 3 letters that go out in late July 1969, each one contains a piece of the 408. And then immediately on Saturday, he says, in response to your asking for more material, I'll be happy to supply more material. He writes those letters for sure. The handwriting, the method, the language, the fact that he has access to knowledge about real cases, and the specific knowledge that he has can all be traced directly to Deputy Hal Snook. And these reports are being sent to him. Tom. They're being sent to him. Attention, Deputy Snook. And not only is his handwriting an absolutely perfect match, but he was a World War II veteran. He trained Filipino, the 408, the cult that's mentioned, the enemies.
Slaves in paradise.
Right. The enemies I have killed will become my slaves in paradise. That's an actual cult among these warriors in the Philippine Islands that Hal Snook actually not only fought side by side, he trained them in cryptography. He trained them in battlefield chemistry, including making roadside bombs of the exact design that's in a Zodiac letter. He was, after the war, he got his journalism degree from San Jose State. He was friends with a couple of famous CIA spooks. When you realize who did this and you asking yourself, why, what the hell is going on? The story gets even more bizarre and more complex. But you have to start with this idea that there was no serial killer. There was no single person doing all of this. There is no way. And then I've identified at least a couple of these people, and they're not the same person. That's the point. That's the whole point. And this is like chapter 1 of that story.
So are you saying that Hal Snook wrote the first 4 letters, including the August the 4th letter, but thereafter didn't write any?
I think he wrote the Stein letter, and I think he wrote the bus bomb letter.
And no more.
But there are differences of opinion on that. And no more. Right, because it's hard to say, because after the August 4th letter, Zodiac doesn't know anything about any real crime after that. And he kind of goes out of his way to prove that he's not real. When you read the files and compare them to the letters, and then you realize who's writing, it's kind of like he's making sure he doesn't get accidentally convicted for murder. But then it comes back to this question: why do it at all? And the only reason he ever gave for writing letters was he wanted the 408 to be published, and then he demands the 340 be published, and he demands that one paragraph about Tukov, and that's it. He doesn't seem to care. He doesn't seem to really care what happens. As long as he gets those 3 things published in the newspaper, he's done. He's finished. He's out of there. The belly letter is obviously not from the same person. There's no way.
Hold up. This thing about Rich, this thing about Zodiac going to Belly's address and like recreating the numbers of like the address on the house, so they think that it's like supposed to be proof that he went there and stood there. So, what do you think, Rich? Are you out on the Belly letter, or?
Oh, I was just going to say something else before that.
Go for it.
What I was going to ask Thomas is, therefore, who wrote the 1987 letter?
Well, to a certain extent, I don't care, because and in the book, what I do in the book is I take the original police files that Graysmith used to write his book, and I prove that he lied about them. Then I show you what those witnesses really said, what fingerprints they really found, what the results really were, and the story that they tell us. And the story that they tell us is there is no evidence linking any 2 of these murders at all.
No, well, what I was going to say is, if you look at the envelope from the 1987 letter.
What was the content? What was the content of that letter?
It was, I'm going to run over kids on Halloween. It was October the 28th, 1987.
I don't think I've even seen that letter.
Well, that's what I'm going to tell you about the envelope. Now, the July the 31st envelopes were not available. They'd never been published. And yet this person who sat down and wrote the envelope in 1987 wrote, please rush the editor twice. He wrote the exact same 13 words that were written on the Vallejo Times Herald envelope from 69. He used absolutely no punctuation on the 87 letter, just like the 1969 envelope. And if you look at, I've tried to blow it up and I can't get a better image, but I believe the 87 letter was spelt Herald with an O, just like the 1969 envelope and just like the Celebrity Cipher in 1990. That means there was 3 Zodiac communications reported, all spelt Herald with an O. And like I said, if you were sitting down in 1987 preparing to hoax an envelope, and they reckoned he copied the 78 letter, which is nonsense, you could not get the exact same 13 words, exact same punctuation by a sheer fluke. I can't see it, and spell Herald incorrectly 3 times.
Who was it mailed to?
The 87 letter, there were 2, actually. There was one mailed to the Examiner. No, one mailed to the Chronicle and one to the Examiner, I believe. And that we haven't seen the one to the Chronicle. I've tried to get it, but the best I could do with the envelope from 87 is blow it up from an image. And I'm trying to get better images. I did apply, I think it was the Vallejo Times Herald. I'm not sure which one it's written to now, but it was written to the Vallejo Times Herald, obviously, because it was addressed to the Vallejo Times Herald.
Yep.
And it was the other one was to the Chronicle. But the point being, I don't know how anybody with no access to the original envelopes. And remember, if the 3 letters on July the 31st, he put Vallejo Times. This is the only time he ever addressed a newspaper by the full title, Vallejo Times Herald. All the others to the Chronicle, the Examiner, And even to the LA Times and Bella, he abbreviated everything. So I don't know how this guy in 87 managed to mimic so perfectly the same 13 words from something he could never have seen, which suggests to me either kept copies of things or he was the Zodiac or the same individual. If you have a look at the 87 letter on my site, go to my site, click the banner, and it will show you exactly the story. And I don't believe anybody could reproduce something so perfectly.
Well, what do you I think you have a good point there. What do you think about the 91 card?
90.
The
1990 Eureka
card. Yeah, the Eureka card. Yeah, what do you think of that?
I tend to think it's genuine, but obviously I can't prove it. But the one good thing that Nin found that I've said before, I don't know if I told Ross, Nin found this on Tom's site. He said, why on earth did the killer do a photocopy of the keys? Remember, they were from Chester Clark Klingle.
To frame him.
Why on earth would you go to that? Why wouldn't you draw the keys and put the number on? Why wouldn't you photograph it? You know, with an Instamatic, no trace. He photocopied them. And if you look at the inventor of electrophotography, it was a guy called Chester Carlson. And I wonder if it was a clue to the name Chester.
Definitely.
Embedded in the card.
Well, I'll be darned. Would you like to hear about another funny coincidence?
Go on, then.
Is it another Chester?
Well, now, again, I have doubts about Hal Snook actually writing the map code letters, but he had the training to do it. He was trained in not only aerial navigation when he was in the Air Force, but he was trained in using polar coordinates like the radar computers do. So the map code is just basic polar coordinates, navigation codes. And if you take, you know, maps in those days weren't quite as accurate as Google Maps, but if you lay it over Google Maps, it points to several crime scenes. And one of the coordinates on the map code, the 37, if you go out 37 inches on that radian that he tells you, you come to, what's the name of the town? Where the letter was, where the card was postmarked from?
On about.
No, we're just talking about the town.
Pleasanton?
No. We just talked about it. The 1990 card was made.
Oh, Eureka.
From Eureka.
Oregon. It's Oregon.
You not only come to Eureka, California, but you come to Chester Klingle's neighborhood in Eureka, California, on the map code that was mailed in 1970. And Chester Klingle apparently saved Hal Snook's life in World War II. Hal Snook's division was transported from New Guinea to the Philippines on a ship, and Chester Klingle was a merchant marine on that ship. They were attacked by kamikazes, and Hal Snook was wounded. And Chester Klingle was the owner of those keys that were mailed, and that Xerox.
Yeah,
I didn't know about the clue about Chester. That's very interesting.
And there's another weird thing in the eulogy, or when he died, he didn't move up to Eureka until after Blandina died in September 1993. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't actually in Eureka when these keys were mailed. Well, the photocopy of the keys.
he dropped them. See, that's why I think he dropped them or he lost them, and Zodiac photocopied it to frame him.
But that means he had a post office box in Eureka long before he ever moved there.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, you know what he did for a living?
Merchant marine.
He had other business interests. So the map code, then you reset you go one radian to the right. There are coordinates that line up with Donna Last's case. There are coordinates that line up with more of Chester Klingle's properties. Chester Klingle was a walnut rancher and pistachio rancher. And he had a walnut and pistachio shelling and wholesale business. And where he owned groves of trees, or where he had the right to pick or to gather nuts, those are coordinates that fall out. And it goes right past that hotel that's in that Peek Through the Pines card and the map code coordinates. What's his name was on the right track with the map code. He just didn't take it far enough. And I just think it's funny that Chester Klingle's neighborhood, it gets that close, is a coordinate on the map code, and Chester Klingle Jr. is the guy who owns those post office box keys Xerox on that card, and he undoubtedly knew Hal Snook.
It's interesting.
there's a lot of interpretations of the map code. I mean, the interesting one I find, I think I've said to Ross before, is the bus bomb one. If you put a line through Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs and travel it down, it goes right over Mount Diablo. And
right.
some guy in the Chronicle was pinpointing those X's around the circumference, and if you tilt the crosshair to 14 degrees, not quite 16 or 17, which was magnetic north, 14. They all fall over the crimes that were being claimed. And I think I told Ross that the only one that didn't fall, the only one that was left over, if you put a line through it, it went through Daniel Williams, Silesian High School, because he threatened, and there was somebody who tried to poison Daniel Williams and threatened the Martinez School. So it was my supposition that the remaining X around that thing was Silesian High School. And right next to it, he wrote, "If you don't print this, I will do my thing." And that would be a little puzzle. What's the remaining X?
Richard, if you extend that line through those crime scenes, starting at Mount Diablo, and you take the scale that's on that Phillips 66 map, okay, if you go out 37 inches along that radian, you come to Eureka, California, and you come to Chester Klingle's neighborhood.
That's interesting.
I haven't done that, but so I couldn't comment on that.
And there are other locations using that map code and those coordinates. They're not just crime scenes. Like there's a private airstrip that belonged to the Stewart family, the Oreo Cow Ranch, famous Oreo Cow Ranch. The owner of that ranch, the Powder Familius, he was one of the first convicted child molesters who had to register with the California database. He had his own private airstrip on his property. His property is where they found the body of Doreen Heskett, the little girl who was murdered in Napa.
Yeah.
And get a load of this. Not only was he a member of the Civil Air Patrol, but he made the county sign a contract that if he went up in his airplane and he spotted Doreen's body, he would get the reward. And he got in his plane and went up in the air and he flew over his own ranch, and there she was. And they had searched that cow pasture twice and never found anything. Well, his airstrip is a coordinate on the map code.
So you believe the Eureka card?
Well, it's one of the coordinates on the map code, and Chester Klingle knew Hal Snook. And when you look at the dates of the Zodiac letters, like remember there's the double letter. You get the card with the bus, the letter with the bus bomb, and the card is that the dragon card? My ass is a dragon. Is that the one I haven't written? I just washed my pen. The dripping
pen card.
The dripping pen card and the bus bomb letter, November 8th, November 9th, 1969, right? The kamikaze attack that Hal Snook was wounded in and Chester Klingle apparently saved him from, that happened November 8th and November 9th, 1944, 25 years to the day. If you look at July 31st, 1944, that's another big event in Hal Snook's, like his commanding officer was killed or something. If you look at the dates the Zodiac letters were mailed, they all line up with very important dates. I think it's the Klingle card, the Eureka card, was mailed with a 44-cent Purple Heart stamp. And Hal got his Purple Heart in 44. Now, according to his records, he wrote a letter when the war was over. He'd been awarded 4 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. Jungle fighting, sometimes behind the lines, in New Guinea and the Philippines. This is like Vietnam on steroids. He did not receive his physical medals, so he gets home, he writes a letter, "I didn't get my medals." They write back and they say, "Well, we can't find any record of you being awarded these medals." Well, if you look at his complete DD-214 today, his list of citations from his commanding officer are on there. So the Army screwed up, but he never got his medals. And the Zodiac letters are mailed on days that are very important days in his military career.
I mean, go ahead, Rich.
Do you believe that the same person who wrote the Eureka card wrote the 2001 letter and card? Or should I say 2001 card?
I don't know, because I think the long story is, I think.
When does Hal Snook pass away, Tom? Does he pass away before?
2010, I think.
Okay, so he's still.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to catch him up on anything.
No.
I was just pointing it out.
That's okay, because I think the long story is, and they didn't even have time to get to this on the documentary, but they know I've done this. I think they're all in it. They might not all know each other personally or directly, but I think Hal Snook was the guy who taught little Bobby Smith how to do all the jobs at a newspaper, because Hal Smith knew how to do those jobs. I think, and Graysmith, he'll never answer this question, where was his father stationed before they were transferred to Japan? If his father was stationed at Lowry Field, that's when Hal Snook was at Lowry Field. And so I think they knew each other, but I can't prove that. But otherwise, I think Hal Snook thought he was doing a favor for a friend of his in the CIA, because I think these letters are a method of communication. He can get coded messages printed on the front page of the Chronicle, and Tony Poe, a high school buddy of Hal's and college buddy of Hal's, did join the CIA, and he was in Southeast Asia in '69, and he was notorious for throwing a fit if he didn't get his San Francisco Chronicle.
The reason I brought it up, because when the person authored the 2001 greetings card, the Eureka card hadn't been released until 2007.
Okay.
And the guy in 2001 could have copied any letter that the Zodiac had ever done, or any envelope that he'd read. But what he did, this person in 2001 would have been, for the first time, sent a greetings card, which mimicked the Eureka card. He wrote 901 Mission Street for the first time, which mimicked the Eureka card. And he wrote 90143, which mimicked the Eureka card, a card he could never have seen in 2001. So the idea that somebody even hoaxed the 2001 card, you could argue that at least he was the author of the Eureka card, because anybody who was just hoaxing would have copied something he'd read or seen previously, and he could never have seen the Eureka card.
Yeah, you're right about that. It's not some casual joker. It's something very, very serious and very calculated and skillful. And it turns out there are these connections between Zodiac and the Manson case, and even the pattern, like Tom O'Neill's Chaos. Have you read that, Richard? Tom O'Neill's book?
No, I haven't, but I did.
Oh my God!
My God! His interview.
Well, he totally debunks Bugliosi's case against the Manson kids. In real life, it's just like Zodiac. In real life, the actual autopsy photos, the actual police reports, the Manson family, there's no evidence they ever murdered anybody. There was a little bit of evidence they tampered with the crime scenes. But there's this media hype, there's this cult myth angle that goes to it. And it's just like Son of Sam. The files are coming out about the Son of Sam case. Same thing. The actual files are telling a different story. And in each of these stories, you have a slightly different fictional character, but they all have one thing in common. They all use written communication to confuse the investigation and to titillate the public.
Okay, well, on that note, how about the theory of a writing team, a letter writing team? And, in Drew's theory, this could consist of Cheney and Allen, and then I would even put Fred Manali in the mix per the deep real estate article. Rich, I know that Jibber Jabber found the thing about the college student is the one who posted the Zodiac. Your
Craig will help me as well.
Yeah, your partners in deep real estate. But here's the thing about that, right? If it is just the college student trying to get Zodiac to respond, how about just a complete coincidence that like Fred Manali dies immediately before that post? That still doesn't put Manali out, in my opinion, because there's still a lot of weird stuff about that guy. Like what I'm saying is it could be a coincidence that it gets posted at the time he dies, but I could still see Manali in some capacity responsible. And then possibly even Snook if you have a letter writing group. And they don't got to meet up with each other to write letters. They could just send each other stuff back and forth,
But Manali has no relevance to the the advertisement in 75 January, has he? So
he dies
Well,
right
it's
before.
not one person.
Right
no,
before it's
75.
posted.
There were two, wasn't there?
Right.
There was one in 75 and there was one in 76 written by the same student.
Yeah.
And by the way,
Even though there might be a
Ross Sullivan died in 1974. Before I forget to mention
77.
that. Or 77. That's right. Yeah. So it's not Ross Sullivan either.
No, it can't be because he couldn't have written the 78
Right.
letter or 87 letter.
No. It's not Sullivan. But
It
anyway,
can't be one person. It can't be one person. The whole point of my book is it can't be one person doing all of this. It just can't be. There's no way.
I mean, even that is good, Rich.
I won't go into detail, but I've got a connection to Snoozy and Furlong running all the way from the July 31st letters all the way up to the July the 13th, 1971 with the Monticello card. Because, well, I won't go into it all, but I could probably link you 6, 7, 8 letters that are all tied together through Snoozy and Furlong. But it will take a few minutes, so I won't bore you with that one. But
well, come on my show and do it. Come on my show.
I like it. There you go. Yeah, definitely. You guys keep it going.
I'll run you through the Snoozy and Furlong thing, which I think connects all the way through. Because most people are pretty confident that what they call the Zodiac ran from 69 to 71 letter-wise. Mm-hmm. But I think he went a lot further. That's the only difference.
So same here. Let's zero in on that, Rich. So I think, what do they call the Exorcist letter? I personally think that's probably Zodiac. And then I still think like the Red Phantom letter is probably Zodiac, to be honest with you.
No, I don't.
So give us what you think, Rich. Like
I don't think. I'm not sure about the Badlands letter. I don't think it is, but
I think it is.
There's no way on earth that the SLA letter or Phantom letter are the Zodiac, because as I pointed out before, most people still think the SLA letter was mailed on the 14th, and it wasn't. Mm-hmm. You go to the FBI files. The first ever 2 FBI files have it mailed on February the 3rd. Mm-hmm. It's the SLA letter, and it was the day before Patty Hearst was kidnapped. And if you remember, I don't know if I told Ned this or you, it started with Dear, editor, and it ended with a friend. Now, I unearthed an SLA file from the Hirnap files, and they typed a letter which was intercepted at the Burlingame Postal Annex only 7 days later on February the 10th. And that began with Dear Editor and was signed A Friend. What are the chances of 2 Symbionese Liberation Army letters being so close together in the Bay Area, just 7 days apart, signing themselves A Friend? And if you add tails to the SLA letter, like the Red Phantom envelope, you've seen the envelope with the long sweeping tails. Add those tails to the SLA letter, they're identical, which means if the SLA letter envelope isn't real and the letter isn't real, neither is the Red Phantom letter, because they're written by the same person. Okay. And I don't see how anybody 7 days later would sign off a friend, write all about the SLA, and the SLA letter was mailed the day before Patty Hearst was kidnapped. I think it's just too coincidental. It was probably written by a friend of the Symbionese Liberation Army.
Well, see, this is why Richard Grinell is the only person, except for Evan from Texas, right, who has studied the letters and is studying the letters rationally and drawing logical conclusions from actual evidence. This was why I was excited to talk to Richard. What you're saying agrees with my most up-to-date work far more than you would ever suspect. So I'm really excited, and I want to hear a lot more about Snoozy and Furlong.
So you don't agree with them either?
I agree with what you just said. Yeah. I'm just nodding my head. And it's so there's something that the public, the myth of the Zodiac Killer is not true. It's so much more to it. There's so much more to the story.
So going back to it, Rich, so what do you like? You get off at, or which ones do you like after Exorcist or whatever you think the last authentic one is?
I don't think the Badlands letter is. And like I said, I don't think the SLA or Red Phantom is. I'm absolutely certain the Albany letter is, but just going back a little bit. The 78 letter is 100% genuine. So is the 86 and 87 letters. You know, the Sir Chow and Say Lee murders that was related to the 86 letter. I think the 87 letter is definitely genuine, as I've explained with the envelope.
Mm-hmm.
And thereafter, I'd say the celebrity card in 1990, the Eureka card, and the 2001 card are possibles, but without exhaustive proof. There's no way of saying they're definitely authentic. I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, I'm with you on most of those. Which is the celebrity card? Refresh me on that.
It's the one in September the 25th, 1990. It was the one with the little code of 8 and 5. Was it 5? 5 and 8. He wrote the same symbols at the bottom on the address side as he did on the little code. It was the one postmarked Oakland, which fits in nicely with Graysmith, actually, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. What go, Tom.
Well, this is what I'm talking about. Nobody else has looked at the letters as I haven't looked at them as thoroughly as Richard. Now, the earlier ones where I'm going to teach a class on fundamentals of handwriting analysis, and I'm going to use the Zodiac letters to do it. But no one, this is what I'm talking about. Richard is rational, intelligent, logical, and he's looking at the evidence for what it is and not trying to make it fit a story he's already got in his head. And that's why I was so excited to talk to him, because it's just like when I talked to Ross about his murders in Southern California. I got a suspect that fits both of these things, and we'll talk about that real soon. So
yeah,
absolutely.
I think I would say it doesn't help to have a suspect, because you must have read people's suspects, and there's a tendency to want to slant everything towards the letters and slant everything to you look through rose-tinted glasses, and I think this actually biases you to looking at the Zodiac scene.
Right.
Whereas I don't really give a damn how old he was and what letters he wrote. Yeah.
Well, that's because at freaking Presidio Heights, he's 45, and at Lake Berryessa, he's 20 to 25, and also 20 at Lake Herman, blah, blah, blah. Rich, which one is the one with the 13 hole?
Hold on. The guy that Falk saw was closer to 40. The guy the Robinson kids saw, they described as 25 to 30. He's 10 years younger. He's 4 inches shorter. He's 60 pounds lighter. And he's reddish brown hair at the actual crime scene. Falk did not see the same guy. And Rodelli did a really good job of really breaking this down, that Falk did not see the same guy that the kid saw messing around the cab.
I would disagree with that, because if you remember the police report, it said it didn't say the Zodiac. The man was last seen walking north on Cherry.
Right.
That means any eyewitness descriptions in that police report had to have happened prior to him turning out of Cherry. And if you look at page 2 of the police report, Paul Stein report, it describes a man in his early 40s. That could only have come from the 3 teenagers.
No. Hold on.
No, that's true. There's no evidence.
Give me 1 second to pull it up.
Okay. I will say while you're looking, there's no evidence to prove the kids ever said 25 to 30. I think that's what the police allotted to that sketch, because what you'd have to believe is by 6:29 on the 12th, the kids said early 40s. Then they suddenly decided within 24 hours to change that to 25 to 30. And then they went back a few days later and said, oh, by the way, we were wrong again. Let's go back to 40 odd, because that's why they put a hesitant age range of 35 to 45, which obviously is a median age range of 40.
Sure.
And if you look at the guy seen running into the Presidio, it said about 40. So actually we have the kids early 40s, we have the guy running into the Presidio about 40, and we have a median age of 40 from the police sketch.
I agree with that, Rich, but here's the problem. Magoo, I still don't know how to pronounce that guy's name. He says mid-20s. Cecilia Shepard says mid-20s. Brian Hartnell said sounded 20s. Nancy Slover, I think, said the voice sounded 20s. If I'm not totally butchering that, you guys can correct me. Right. Okay. So that one's a little different. But so one thing that's covered in the documentary, Rich, is when they get, what's her name, Tom? Is it Linda Jensen? That's the college girl, one of the 3 college girls from
she knew Cecilia.
Berryessa.
She was friends with Cecilia. That was something that, Hal Snook leaves out a lot of things in his report when he interviews those girls, and he fudges the time a little bit compared to what Linda said.
Yeah, but what I want to get specifically into is the Lake Berryessa lurker sketch, Rich. So the the way she tells it is this guy was creeping on them through the trees, and he kept getting closer and closer, and they said like they got like a dark vibe from him, right? And then is it Lundbad, Horan, who says that he thinks that Zodiac's face is the Lake Berryessa lurker, like that was definitely him, and that composite really doesn't look like the Presidio Heights composite. Let's keep that real. So
that's Dave Collins. That was Deputy Dave Collins, a good friend of Dennis Land's, who he tells one story about who found Brian's car in the report, and he tells the media a different story about who found the car. He tells in the report, he says that Dennis's brother Raymond found the car, and he tells the media, I found the car. So why is he changing his story?
But I mean, honestly, Tom, that could just be attributed to loss of memory over interview. I see what you're saying, though. It's an inconsistency. I agree with you, but I'm just saying I don't know if that's like dead to rights. You know what I mean?
You know,
but anyway, that was Dave Collins.
For sake of the record, yeah. I agree. But so Rich, like, essentially, what the doc was getting at was the Berryessa guys think the lurker sketches Zodiac, which, like, up until this point, you know, because the girls looked at him and said, like, his hair was perfectly combed, he looked nice. Like, those descriptions don't really add up to the guy at Presidio. And then also, this wasn't in the doc, Tom, but the dentist and his son who have the rifles, and they see the sloppily dressed man walking along the side of the road that was supposedly Zodiac coming from Hartnell and Shepherd. And he didn't do anything to those guys because they were carrying their hunting rifles. So he's like, he's not going to like run up on them like that, you know, being sloppily dressed. But if I'm not mistaken, like the way the sunbathing college girls described the other guy was like, he looked nice, he was dressed nice. And also I thought the story was he was smoking butts while he was watching them, and he left them all there, and they didn't collect the butts. So there's just like a lot that doesn't gel with those two descriptions.
What you've got is Dr. Rayfield and his son were described as being 0.8 miles north of the crime scene. Mm-hmm. And 5100 Knoxville Road, which is where the three girls were early at the root beer stand, 2 miles, they were at 2 miles north of that. If you put that on a map, it's the identical place. So you'd have to, it was at Smittle Creek. So what you'd have to assume based on those measurements is both Rayfield and his son and the three girls were in the identical spot at different times of the day. Mm-hmm. And the fact that two people came forward that day, both reporting a suspicious individual when they didn't have to come forward if there was nothing going on.
True.
We're in the identical place, along with obviously the stabbing itself. I find that very curious. But what I don't understand is they went to great lengths to plaster cast those footprints. All they had to do was take these people's eyewitness descriptions of this man, go up there, get the footprints. They could have compared them to the footprints by Brian Hartnell's car going down to the crime scene. And this question would not be asked today. We'd know it.
I agree.
Or otherwise. I
agree. So you know who they is, right? Who processed that crime scene?
Landon Snook.
Hal Snook. Hal Snook is the one who handled all the evidence in the Doreen Heskett case. Hal Snook handled all the evidence in the Linda Kins case, and he comes up with this bizarre scenario for how Willie commits this murder. And speaking of so anyway, in the documentary, Linda said they were just one little prong of beach away from where Brian and Cecilia were.
Yeah, the next peninsula over
beach.
Yeah,
and when they left, they saw Brian and Cecilia's car parked on the side of the highway, but they didn't see the killer's car parked there. Just like I say in my book, the killer did not park behind Brian and Cecilia.
No, I don't believe he did either.
Yeah, I wonder about that.
No footprints go over there.
Yeah.
And then here she is. She said she was terrified all these years to speak because my question is, why would you let those three girls? Well, I think it's just Linda got a good look at him.
Yeah.
The blonde girl didn't turn around and look at him. I wonder if he was looking for Cecilia and thought the blonde girl was Cecilia, because the redheaded girl's the one who's watching him. She keeps looking to see if he's still there. Why would he let them see his face and then put on a mask to attack Brian and Cecilia? Unless he was trying to create an alibi for his buddy, his accomplice.
You lost me on that one. I mean, I get generally what you're getting at, but
why would he show? Why would he keep showing his face? It almost seems like the only reason he.
But Cecilia saw him, Tom. She saw him walk up before he put the mask on.
Then why did he put a mask on at all?
Because he's doing an execution, a water sacrifice execution ritual, a la the Mikado.
Whether he knew that Cecilia saw him is unknown, and also it was quite a distance away.
Yeah,
but
it was from a distance, but
he knows the girls on the beach are getting a good look at him.
Yeah.
Why would he? And the thing about it is, he can't be anybody else except either the killer or the accomplice of the killer, because there's nobody else there, and his car isn't parked there either. So it's either the same guy, or it's his buddy. And it turns out that there is a known serial killer who did make snuff films, who was living in the area at the time, and his MO is 100% identical to what happened at Lake Berryessa.
So the accomplice theory. So, Rich, if we go back to Lake Herman Road, where Zodiac supposedly gets out of the passenger side and fires from the passenger side, and then once again we supposedly have these two individuals at Lake Berryessa. So one Zodiac Zodiac with an accomplice.
And then at Blue Rock Springs Park, you get 5 shots. Then he walks away. Then somebody, maybe the same person, maybe a second person, comes back with the same gun, fires 4 more shots. It could be two people at Lake Herman Road, or I mean, it's at Blue Rock Springs Park.
I'd say Berryessa or Herman. I don't know about Blue Rock though, because when you hear Majot gurgling, I mean, the same guy can just walk back and shoot him though.
But it could be a second guy, because he didn't get a look at the first time around, so it could be a second guy.
You know the theory I came out with about the casings. That was my
what you guys did on the podcast. Yeah, it was great.
I mean, like I said, I don't agree that it was 2 shooters at Lake Herman Road, but if you imagine,
not 2 shooters, but he got out of the passenger side of the other car.
An accomplice driving him, a driver.
Right.
I've got a different take on it. I mean, I have a different take than most people on this Lake Herman Road thing, in the sense that if you look at the police reports, and you read them and you take the most logical conclusion from them, the idea that Zodiac or this person, pulled into the turnout to the right side of the Rambler is not the most obvious choice based on the police report. Everybody seems to ignore Robert Connolly. The last person that Rambler was seen positioned was on the west bank facing south at the gate. So, in other words, the last position of the Rambler was lined up on the west bank before a second vehicle was spotted in that turnout by James Owen.
Yep.
So the logical conclusion based on that is Zodiac could have easily arrived behind them on the west bank and forced them over, which is why the Rambler was in 3 different positions that night. Yep. It was on the east bank. It moved to the west bank, maybe to keep out of the headlights.
Maybe, unless he just got a little confused.
But in the photograph, well, yes, but he knew that area. He was.
I like this theory. I like that theory.
And he said it twice.
But the engine of David's car was cold. They'd been sitting there for a while. They hadn't been driving around and moving the car around. The engine was cold.
Yeah, but it wouldn't heat up the engine much moving over.
Yeah, starting and stopping it real quick, Tom. Yeah.
But the point is, that's the last. Everybody seems to just want to pick and choose these eyewitnesses at Lake Herman Road. All I'm saying is, the last position the Rambler was seen in before there were 2 cars in the turnout was on the west bank. So why do we assume that he arrived when it was on the east bank? He could have easily arrived exactly the same as Blue Rock Springs behind it, signaled to them and said,
Sure. But if you look at the position in the shell casings, it looks like he got out of the passenger side of the second car. I've
got a theory for that one as well, but.
Well, maybe. Okay. I'm not saying that it proves it 100%. What I'm saying is, just like Richard said, when you look at the actual evidence, it starts telling a different story from the myth that we've known all these years. Now, here's the interesting thing. We went out to that crime scene to shoot the documentary.
It's one of the best scenes.
And that turnout's not like you picture it.
No, it's twice as big back in 68.
No, it isn't. Well, there's a little bit more. The road is narrower, but that's
the telegraph pole.
We measured it out. It's actually a very tiny little space. It's just that the road was a little bit narrower, and so it looked like in the photographs it looks like a big space. It's not. It's definitely not a lover's lane. But right across the highway, there is the perfect lover's lane. Why weren't they there? There's a perfect lover's lane literally directly across the highway, but they weren't there. And I think Richard's right. I mean, there's a whole hour and 15 minutes that's missing. And then maybe they moved their car a couple of times because they're there staking out what's going on like they had threatened to do. And I think that's why they get killed. They get killed by this gang of drug dealers because they've come to the conclusion that there are snitches, and they have already killed several snitches in Vallejo. Why would they stop now?
Go ahead, Rich.
Just one quick thing. And also the idea that Zodiac pulls in, let's say he does pull into the right side of the Rambler, hops out, starts firing, and ushers them out the car. Well, that can't happen. Because if you remember James Owen, he said when he went past, nobody was in or around the cars. I'm only going on what he says.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, if you get James Owen's testimony, when he comes from Vallejo, he reports no cars in front of him. And I measured a stretch of that road, and he saw no vehicles in front of him. So any vehicle that was there had to be at least 40 seconds ahead. When he approaches the turnout, he sees no headlights from the opposite way going in, which means when he arrives at the turnout, there's supposed to be two vehicles there, parked there with nobody doing a damn thing. Even if they were in the cars and he didn't notice them, those cars were just sitting there for 30 seconds, 40 seconds, maybe even a minute. We don't know. Could have been 2 minutes, could have been 3 minutes. So what was the guy doing pulling up next to the Rambler and then just sitting there like an idiot? If you're going to get a surprise attack, you jump straight out the car.
Yeah, you don't pull up and wait.
No, so those cars were sitting idle in that turnout from anywhere to 30 seconds up to several minutes, and nobody was in or around the cars. Now, the logical conclusion is that James Owen didn't see anybody in the vehicles, but it still wouldn't explain why they were just sitting there for a long period of time doing nothing.
Because remember, if you've ever been there, from either direction, your headlights go straight into any car that's parked there.
Yeah, so you can see everything.
You would see if there was somebody in there. Now, with all that in mind, Richard, think about this. What are Betty Lou and David doing out there? Nobody ever thought of that when they leave her friend Sharon, when they leave Sharon's house, there might have been somebody waiting for them in the back seat with a gun and made them go there. And that's now listen.
But then why were three of the doors locked?
This is what
good call.
This is what you have to do when you realize there was no single serial killer.
Hold on, Tom. Hold on. I see where you're going, and I appreciate the angle, but the car track tires. Why isn't it a similar Rambler or whatever? It's supposed to be the same type of model car that pulls up, right? So if someone's sitting in the back seat, why the other car then to hold them
to pick them up when it's done?
Okay, I guess.
Yeah,
you got out of it. You got out of it.
I'm not saying I can prove that. What I'm saying is maybe the reason they were sitting there was because this was not a random serial killer ambushing people by surprise. Maybe there was a conversation that took place before the killer got out of the car.
It's speculation. So in the myth of the Zodiac killer, Tom cast doubt on this story, since we're doing Lake Herman Road, Rich, about the kid pulling up at the V intersection, and he said like the car followed him. And then I thought this was a verified story, but apparently you don't buy this one, Tom. So what do you think, Rich? You know about this kid who said he got chased at Lake Herman Road? Was it before or after the attack, Tom?
Oh, a couple hours before.
Right? Yeah. Well, all I know is that his first story gets wildly more exciting during the second retelling.
Right.
Yeah.
The first time was it a blue Valiant he saw. Then it turned into a Chevrolet, which was nice and convenient.
Yeah.
And then it turned in from two Caucasian males into one Caucasian. And if you read the chase story, the chase was pretty docile. It wasn't really anything major, the first retelling. The next time he was on his bumper and he was racing after him.
More violent.
yeah, I think this story is exaggerated, which a lot of people did to increase their significance in the Zodiac case. So I'm not, but if it's true, it's worth consideration. But I don't like people changing their story and making it more exciting. And
exactly,
But that's what happens in almost every single story in the Zodiac case. So I mean, it's like, I always thought that this one was kind of verified, but neither of you guys like it, so I'm willing to concede. Yeah,
you're on about William Crowe.
The story does change. I give you guys that, but it made a lot of sense to me that Zodiac trying to pick it is it me or does that not match the MO? If you have the Lake Berryessa lurker being Zodiac, he's rolling up on the girls to try to scout them for a victim. It doesn't work out, so he waits till Brian and Cecilia pull up at Lake Herman Road. If he gets at David and Betty Lou before that, he's trying to follow the other guy to see if he can corner him, in my opinion, or I'm totally wrong on this.
What went wrong?
Either one.
If there's one Zodiac and he's scoping out the three girls, what went wrong? Why didn't he move in? What could possibly
because it's more difficult. Three people is harder to tie together and control.
They're girls, and he's got a gun.
He almost messed up Brian. His hand was shaking, and he was scared because Brian was 7 feet tall. He practically bungled it, and then he didn't tie them up properly. Brian still got out when he was dying. So he made, and in no case are the mistakes more prevalent than Lake Herman Road. In my opinion, that is the pattern moving on from Gaviota 63, where he made it multiple mistakes. He attempts to make his epic return at Lake Herman Road. He comes back, makes mistakes again, so he doesn't claim it because she gets up and runs. So he almost bungled that when he had to shoot her in the back. He doesn't take credit till he does Blue Rock Springs, where he finally got it right in his mind, then makes the phone call, then writes the letter. It's the carryover of his mistakes until he gets it right, in his own opinion.
And his car was in close proximity to the three girls. Maybe he thought this is too risky, like you said.
They recognize his car.
His car's close. I'll move it further north, which is why the individual seen by Rayfield and Son later in that day may have been heading beyond that location to where he'd moved his car earlier.
Exactly.
But then when you read the files that Morph got, when you read the radio dispatcher's log and things, if he parked his car any place on the highway, how did he get out of the area without being seen? Because both ways were, and it's just like Lake Herman Road. Now, Richard, you've timed out all these witness statements. You've talked about how difficult it was for the killer's car to get to this scene. Where did the killer's car go after the shooting? How did he get out of there?
Well, after
there are other witnesses that they didn't come across a car leaving the crime scene.
What, Lake Herman Road, do you mean?
Right. In Lake Herman Road. How did he escape?
He drove away. There's no other way to get out.
Nobody. There are witnesses who he would have run into him.
I believe he just drove back to Vallejo.
How? Because there are witnesses who would have seen him. There's nobody.
Yeah, but they don't have every car chronicled in and out, Tom. Come on, let's be real.
They don't need to, because there are witnesses who should have seen that car go by, but they didn't. However, that dirt road that goes straight south, that goes to the other highway, that's accessed only by locked gates, maybe that's how he got away. Maybe he had the combinations to those locks. Because if you go down that road, if you go to where that dirt road meets the highway, on that corner, that's Ben Villarreal's house. And he's the cop whose name keeps coming up in these cases. He's the cop who said he drove past the Blue Rock Springs Park and he saw what was apparently Hoffman's car, but he didn't see Darlene's car. And he was supposed to be keeping John Doe Watt under surveillance anyway. What are they doing at Blue Rock Springs Park if they're not keeping him under surveillance? So the killer could have gone down that dirt road. Now, when we were out there, we found something. We found an a little old house out there. Because I was thinking that the pink house that they talk about, that the Hells Angels used to store drugs, there's a recreation area out there by Lake Herman Road, and there's an old house, the caretaker's house. I thought that was the house that they were talking about. Apparently, it's not. If you pull into that turnout and you go underneath the gate or climb over the fence or whatever, it's very easy. It's about, is it 100 feet to get to this old It's a little bigger than a shack.
I don't know. There wasn't a shooting range there.
That was where the party was supposed to be that night. That they said they were going to be in that house, and that was. So there is a house out there.
Here's okay.
Now, so at Lake Berryessa, if the killer didn't park along the highway, and he couldn't have, then where did he park? Well, he could have parked. Now it's a public parking area, but the old levee road, before they turned it into a lake, that dirt road, that was the road that Brian had crawled back to, and that's where he got picked up by the park ranger. Well, if you look at the shoe prints that Hal Snook tracked from the crime scene up to the victim's car, back down to the crime scene, it's obvious that he must have parked along that levee road, and that levee road was only accessible through locked gates, and only law enforcement knew the combinations, and they got multiple locks on them. So we have two of these crimes where it looks like the killer used roads that were only accessible to law enforcement. I mean, and we have law enforcement people at the scene of the crime or whatever who are on that road.
I believe after stabbing Brian and Cecilia, he walked 20 minutes back up north, seen by the Rayfields going past.
Yep, exactly.
Which is it, because if he'd have left the crime scene,
why would he leave his car that far away? And I don't know,
because the girls saw it the first time.
He moved it up from the girls. He went back to see if they were there, but they'd gone. And then I think he just trawled the hillside, because if he'd have written on the car door around 6:30, then he shouldn't have been making a phone call 1 hour and 10 minutes from Napa if he went directly there. It doesn't take that long. There's at least 20 minutes missing. Exactly. And that's where I think he walked back up north to his car. He was trawling the hillsides.
100%, and they saw him.
Which is why I think he tied them up, because that way
they saw a guy. They saw a guy.
Where are the footprints? Where are the footprints of him walking away from the crime scene?
That's what Rich was saying earlier.
That's what I was saying earlier, but they didn't make. They should have done footprints.
They didn't cast them.
The simple answer is he parked on that dirt road, walked down to the crime scene, walked past his vehicle, back up to Brian's car, walked back to his pickup truck, and then went. And then pretended to respond to the crime scene later. That's the simplest explanation. And it just happens to jibe with what happened to the second car at Lake Herman Road when the only escape route. Now, he may have turned onto that actual Lover's Lane. He may have hidden out there. But it's also possible there was a road he could have driven down, and it just so happens that Ben Villarreal, who's a very fishy cop, I mean, every cop you ever talk to tells you about Ben Villarreal being a one-man force, lives at the end of that road, and he's an undercover narcotics officer working with Richard Hoffman. You guys know Richard Hoffman had been shot before, right?
I don't think I heard that. No. I don't think I heard that one.
The thing that got me started, when I started studying the Zodiac letters and just reading them as letters to the editor and reading them as literature, the thing that got me started was when I found out that Voight and Butterfingers had the files. I always wondered, because Graysmith makes this mistake, and a lot of cops made this mistake. They start believing the letters instead of believing the evidence. Mm-hmm. So when Zodiac said, I did not leave the scene of Blue Rock Springs Park, gunning my engine and squealing my tires, I wondered, is there, and he claims, he promises, dear editor, if you check with the police can prove that this is true. Now, Mike Migeot and the witness, the caretaker's son, they both agreed that the killer left gunning his engine, squealing his tires, and throwing gravel. They both agreed on that.
He just said it like, I don't think he said gunned super hard, but just it kicked up some.
Right, they both agreed that he left at high speed. So I was wondering if dear editor had been able to verify with police that a suspect had left the scene of the crime slowly and quietly, and by golly, they could. There is a report. There is a report of a kid being pulled over. As the first units arrive, Mayring and Lindemann are in the front of the parade of cop cars heading out to Blue Rock Springs Park. They see this gray caddy leave slowly and quietly from the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park. So they pull him over. Hoffman comes along seconds later before they can even talk to the kid. You know, it's a boulevard. There's a little divider in between. Hoffman pulls over and hollers at Myron and Lindemann because supposedly he doesn't have a radio in his car. He says, hey, I know that kid Hold on to him. I want to talk to him. Well, the kid he's talking about is Andy Nicolatis Jr. And Mike Michaud mentions there was another car that pulled in and he couldn't get the people to come over. Well, that was Andy Nicolatis Jr. and his girlfriend. Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing that proves the Zodiac letters are authentic. He knows, but that would mean that he's Andy Nicolatis. And the other funny thing is there was no mention of this in the newspaper because Andy's father was a prominent businessman. So how did the killer know that the cops had pulled over a suspect, that the cops knew about a potential suspect? And the funny thing about Andy Nicolatis Jr. is, how does a juvenile undercover narcotics officer know who he is and think he might be a suspect? He must have been a juvenile offender. And the funny thing is, Andy also got shot a few months before Blue Rock Springs Park.
Can I?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Can I give you a better thing for your theory on that one?
Okay.
It doesn't include Nicolatis. If you remember Zodiac in the August the 4th letter, mm-hmm. He said he mentioned about the Vallejo paper and what you just said about leaving the scene.
Right.
If you go to the July the 6th Vallejo paper, it has a statement in there from George Bryant, which is the caretaker's son. And it said the car took off at high rate of speed, peeling rubber. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Zodiac said he left the scene with squealing tires and racing engine. If you go to page 15...
No, he said I did not. He said I did not.
Sorry, I did not. I did not leave the scene with squealing tires and
as the paper said,
But if you go to the police report on page 15... it's reported that George Bryant said he heard a car take off at super speed and it burned rubber and it was squealing its tires. So the Zodiac used squealing tires, just like the police report where it said squealing of tires.
Ooh, right.
That's pretty good, Tom.
Exactly.
That's pretty good.
Exactly. But it wasn't even one hoaxer, and it wasn't like a joke or a prank. I'm telling you, it turns out it's like Son of Sam. It's not so much that you notice an obvious connection between the victims. The victims are kids. Son of Sam, the victims are all like teenagers, early 20s. Zodiac, the victims are all teenagers, early 20s. One guy is 29 years old. And at first glance, you don't think there's a connection between the kids. But then you find out that there are connections between the parents that are like not only motives for murder, but motives for maybe people not talking, people not coming to the police. Maybe people are telling the police, leave this one alone. And you see the same thing in Zodiac. It's not a joke. It's not a prank. It's something far more bizarre. And I'm telling you guys, I'm telling Drew, I'm telling Richard, what you're telling me actually fits in with the whole big picture. This is just like chapter 1.
How about
Ross, can I just nip off for 30 seconds? I need the loo.
Yeah. Do your thing, man. I got you covered. I got something for you when we get back. Tom, how about Cecilia going to college in Riverside and then Sherry Jo Bates's boyfriend going to college in the Bay? There's always that rumor that like Cecilia and Sherry knew each other, but like I've never seen anything definite on it, you know?
Well, here's the funny thing. They looked alike. They looked a lot alike. And the girls at the beach in Lake Berryessa said, you know, they knew Cecilia. I still think, like, I have never seen an actual murder case where it was a random victim. I've never seen that ever. And like in Son of Sam, once you learn about the victims and their parents, you begin to realize these are not random victims. The same thing in Zodiac. You begin to realize they're not random victims. They're not all, like David and Betty Lou were not in the drug scene, but they were interfering with the drug scene. That's why they get murdered. Mm-hmm. Darlene, you know, she's hanging out with undercover narcotics cops, blah, blah. It almost looks like she took Mike there to get shot, maybe. And she gets shot in the process. She gets double crossed or whatever. You know, a lot of this stuff makes a lot of sense. Maybe that's not the exact thing. So when you figure out who they are and who their parents are, you find out this link between Darlene Ferrin and Sherry Jo Bates.
That's even more interesting.
And that link is our suspect, your friend and mine, James Douglas Crabtree Phillips Crabtree.
I got him on the list. I want Rich to hear about him because he's.
And then I need, when Rich comes back, maybe I'll just go right now.
I'm here.
I need to. Okay, you keep him busy for a minute. I'm going to tell you guys about the last week's episode of my podcast talking about links. When you just real quickly, Richard, my golden rule of thumb in investigating any cold case or any cases, there is no such thing as a random victim. These victims were targeted, and these victims were targeted in advance. Maybe so, like it's like Son of Sam. The victims are all young, and there doesn't seem to be an immediate connection. They didn't all go to the same high school. They're not friends. They don't all work at the same McDonald's. But when you find out who their parents are, you find out things like links between Darlene Ferrin and Sherry Jo Bates. And then you have a suspect who turns out to be solid gold for both of those murders. And I'll tell you about that as soon as I come back. I'm going to go get a drink. I'm going to go get a bottle of water.
Do you think, Prof?
How can I mute my camera?
So what I was asking him, Rich, was about this. And again, this might be totally unfounded, but the rumor that Cecilia knew Sherry because Cecilia was going to school in Riverside at the time. Obviously, later, but obviously Sherry was down there before. And then Sherry's boyfriend went to SDSU, was it? Or fiance, rather, went to SDSU. So Sherry kind of has that connection to the Bay Area. Again, I'm not saying Zodiac, killed Sherry, but it's a weird line of connection,
There was some connection. Was it Tom Voigt who said there was a connection between Cecilia Shepard and Sherry Jo Bates through a restaurant?
And that might be it. And I know it comes up here and there, but I don't know, how legit is it? Did we ever find anything concrete on it?
Well, from what I've read, there's nothing concrete. But
right.
I think according to Tom, he got somebody contacted him with this information. I don't know. There's no way to verify it. To be
right,
not from my angle, anyway.
Yeah, agreed. It's Tom was kind of doubling down through Sherry and Darlene Ferrin. Who I think is interesting. And obviously, I don't know if we just mentioned to you this at the beginning, but James Crabtree makes his appearance in the Myth of the Zodiac documentary. It's one of the more interesting interviews in the documentary.
Yeah, he turns out to be, there's a lot to think that he's the prime suspect in the murder of Darlene Ferrin. Well, here's the funny thing. Darlene's dad did classified work at Mare Island, where he worked. He was a machinist, and he worked on nuclear submarines and other, secret stuff. Mm-hmm. Darlene's father-in-law, Arthur Ferrin, he was an electronics engineer at Mare Island, working on submarines and torpedoes and things. Sherry Jo Bates's father was a machinist at the Corona Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Riverside, where they did the Navy's rocket projects and the Navy's satellite projects.
And her brother served as well.
Jim Crabtree's older brother Otis was a Navy machinist at the Corona Naval Ordnance Laboratory in 1966. And Jim and Darlene had gone. They meet supposedly in August of 65. Darlene is working at AT&T in San Francisco, worked in the big headquarters. She's some kind of clerk. She had immaculate handwriting, by the way. They leave. They go to Albany because apparently Darlene has a job there because AT&T is taking over New York Telephone and they're switching over. So Darlene has a job there. So Jim goes along, basically sponging off his wife. He gets a part-time job proofreading at the Albany Times-Union or whatever, where Richard Gaikowski is working. No, he works in the same building at the Knickerbocker News. Now, my point is this. They come back to Vallejo, October 1966. Jim stayed, he has a brother who lives in Reno. He has brothers. When Jim stays with his older brothers a lot. Jim was not adopted. Jim was the biological child of Diamond and Kathleen Phillips. He had three half brothers. She always treated him like a stepson, but but my point is, his brother Otis worked with Sherry Joe Bates's father, and he was back from Albany, New York in October of 66. He meets Darlene August of 65. What's her name gets murdered at the Enlisted Men's Club on the Presidio grounds in August of 65. And he has a friend who lives easy walking distance. He's got several addresses in his address book that they just ring the Presidio. Like you walk across the street from the Presidio grounds and that's somebody in Jim's address book.
Interesting.
And the Joseph Bates and Leo Suinen would have belonged to the same union, and they both did classified work for the Navy. That's a funny link, and it turns out that Jim Crabtree is a very good suspect in both of those murders, because. And then not only does Sherry Joe's new boyfriend, her fiance, he doesn't just go to college in San Francisco. He goes to San Francisco State University, where Paul Stein is a graduate assistant teaching freshman composition like I teach, and could easily have been his teacher.
I remember you told me that one time. That was pretty wild. So let's just go ahead, Rich.
What was James Crabtree's motivation? Just anger?
Yeah.
Well, I think because that photograph of Jim and Darlene, where Jim says it's not me, it's a guy who looked like me, but it's
the
not
surgeon.
Me.
He said it was the surgeon who operated on her knee.
Yeah, in the documentary, he says it's an orthopedic surgeon who fixed her knee after they went skiing on Mount Shasta because he grew up there.
Yeah.
Well, that house, we've located that house. It's not Darlene's Uncle Frank's house. Darlene's Uncle Frank did have a house on that street, but that's not the house. That house belonged to a man named Horst Heinz Eifler. He was a paper-clipped Nazi. And I'm
always up for paperclip.
His brother had a house in that neighborhood as well. So what? When Darlene and Jim moved back from upstate New York, there's a German couple. Well, he was technically born in Buffalo, New York. His father moved the family back to Hitler's Germany, and he grew up in the Hitler Youth and might have been even, did a little fighting at the end of the war. He and his German wife moved from upstate New York to Vallejo to open one of the first International House of Pancakes franchises. And that's where Darlene learns how to be a waitress, is working for the Schlagers, who were Nazis. What are Jim and Darlene doing hanging around all these Nazis when their family all work for tops on secret naval technology and all of these other things? When you research the victims, you realize there is no such thing as a random victim. What's that got to do with Cecilia Ann Shepard? Well, Cecilia Ann Shepard had lived in Riverside. Maybe she was friends with Sherry Joe, or maybe they were just both stalked by the same guy. Now, I don't know what Crabtree's alibi is for the murder of Cecilia Ann Shepard, but keep another thing in mind. The first two murders, you have what appears to be a guy who's just driving around. He spots a potential victim, hops out of his car, bang, 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 hops back in his car, and he's gone. That's the first two murders. The second two, forget Sherry Joe Bates.
Yeah.
The second two murders, here's a guy who spends a good 15 minutes shooting the breeze with his victims before he moves in to kill. That's kind of a funny, consistent change in his MO.
Except if you follow my theory, which is the first time he tried to do it at a Gavita 63, he messed it up because he didn't have the I'm an escaped convict backup plan. He lost control of Dominguez, who punched him in the face a few times while he was armed. So he comes back to Berryessa later on. I need this cover story so I can tell them that there's no actual threat that I'm going to do anything to them other than rob them and steal their car.
If he targets Darlene, why does he go to the passenger side?
There you go.
Thank you. Now, here's something else, Richard. If you look very carefully at the autopsy drawings and the autopsy report, read that carefully. And
I've read them all.
Well,
I'm
speaking hypothetically. I'm speaking hypothetically. Bear with me.
I know what you're going to say.
Get him, Rich, get him.
There were only 9 shots fired. at Blue Rock Springs Park.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
There were only 9 shell, and that some people, but there's a 10th bullet that has to be explained.
No, there doesn't.
Yes, there is.
No, the missing shell is at
No,
Herman.
I've gone through the autopsy report.
Nope. There's an extra
Missing,
bullet. It's
missing
the
shell
one.
at Herman.
It's the one that's lodged in the back of the seat, the front seat of the Corvair. There's a bullet lodged in the back. Now, 2 questions. Number 1, how did it get there? And number 2, why was it traveling so slowly that it would get stuck there? And there's a 3rd question. What happened to the slug that went through Mike's neck and glanced off his jaw? Where did it go?
I know where it went.
It went into the back of the seat. If you count the number,
they pulled out the. Didn't they pull out the blanket that it was?
If you count,
the other car?
No.
That was Herman.
If you count the number of entry and exit wounds and the perforate, like sometimes Darlene, at first she's getting shot from the side. The bullets are coming through her arm and into her chest. Then she turns. She's trying to escape. She's trying to climb out the window. She gets shot in the back, and the bullets are passing through her chest and through her arm or wrist. And then sometimes, because she's a tiny little thing, and this is a Luger, and some of the bullets go out through the window and they never find them. Some of the bullets lodge in the door. There's an extra bullet, unless, and this is very simple, and it explains one of these things that Zodiac thinks he has to explain, and that is that Mike was never sitting in the front seat. Mike was already sitting in the back seat when they got to Blue Rock Springs Park, because the fingerprints that were found on that passenger door handle are not Mike's. They think they either belong to the killer or they definitely belong to somebody else. They're not Mike's fingerprints. Mike wasn't sitting in the front seat and then jumped in the back. He was sitting in the back seat the whole time, maybe hiding for a while, and somebody else was sitting in the front seat.
Well, I would say that's not possible.
Why?
Because Darlene Ferrin had 9 entry wounds and 7 exit wounds. That's on the autopsy report.
That's right. So when you and if you look how they line up, and then you look at the drawings, those are called perforation wounds. So some of the shots passed all the way through her chest, into her arm, and through her arms. So that's why you have all these entry and exit wounds. If you add them all up and you add up Mike's wounds, you get exactly 9 shots and you get exactly 9 shell casings. But then you have this 10th bullet, which is lodged in the back of the front seat. So it had to be fired when Mike was in the back seat. And that's the bullet that passed through his jaw. And that's where it ended up. And Mike was never sitting in the front seat.
If you had Michael Mageau in the back seat, then Darlene Ferrin could have never had 9 entry wounds.
Mm-hmm, because they're one bullet. It's one bullet causing multiple entry wounds. Because she's passing all the way through her body. That's why you have all those entries.
2 bullets were found in her body. They were the 2 bullets fired through Mike Mageau in the front seat.
No, they were the ones that were fired through her shoulder, because the bullet track goes through her shoulder.
No, there were 3.
Yeah, but that's still through the direction Mike is sitting, though.
She had 4. She had 4 entry.
We spent a year on this on my blog. If you look at the sketches and read the report, there are exactly 9 shots fired, except for the 10th bullet that's lodged in the back of the back seat, the back of the front seat.
There's a lot of evidence to prove she was actually shot first, believe it or not. Because she had 4 entry wounds and 4 exit wounds to her arms. That means the bullets hit her right arm, exited her right arm, hit her left arm, exited her left arm. 2 shots that hit Mageau went through into her. This is the only way you can explain 9 entry wounds. If Michael Mageau,
Let him finish, Tom.
If Michael Mageau was in the back seat all the time, there's no way 9 shots could have been fired, and she had 9. She could not have had 9 entry wounds. She had to have received 2 that passed through Mageau.
No,
agreed.
No, because that doesn't. Okay, then where does the bullet in the back of the front seat come from? If those bullets pass through Mike, remember, there was 1 bullet found inside his clothing that had not passed through his shirt, right?
There was 1 bullet found on him when he was outside. It had stayed in his clothing.
And there was 1 bullet embedded in his thigh.
Yes, there was one in his thigh.
That's right. And there's one bullet that hit him in the jaw and deflected off his jawbone.
And one in his shoulder.
Where is that bullet? Where'd that bullet go, Richard?
Well,
Where'd the bullet go that was deflected? Where did it go?
There were only 9. Well, the shot into his neck, chin area, and the one into his shoulder both passed through him into Darlene.
No, because the one that passed his shoulder was stuck in his clothing because she was found on the ground outside. And the one that hit him in the jaw didn't go straight through Darlene. It was deflected off of his jaw into the back of the front seat. Where is that's a 10th bullet, unless everything that you said is right except for one tiny thing. If you move Mike to the back seat, and the bullet that hit him in the face ends up in the back of the front bench seat. That's because his jawbone slowed it down. And then he had one hit him in the shoulder, and then he had one in the chest that ended up in his shirt. Then you only need 9 bullets to explain all of those wounds. If you do it with him starting in the front seat, you need 10 bullets because you have to account for the one that's in the back of the back seat. And so that's why Zodiac thinks he has to explain how Mike ended up in the back seat because he was never in the back seat in the first place.
Can we agree to disagree?
Yeah, exactly.
I will make a video, and you come on my show sometime, and I'll do it before.
Yeah, certainly.
We hash this over. You're right about everything except one thing. If Mike starts out in the front seat, then you have to have 10 bullets. But if Mike was in the back seat the whole time, you only need 9 bullets, and they only found 9 shell casings. And that would explain why those aren't Mike's fingerprints on the front door handle. Somebody else got in the car after Mike did.
So the 9mm Luger casings, we don't actually know that it's a Luger, right? Because all we know are those are 9mm Luger casings. So that could be fired from any 9mm pistol.
Or 38. Most 38s. Most 38.
Dual action.
Most 38 owners, semi-automatic or revolver, they use 9mm ammo because partly because your barrel wears down and you need slightly fatter bullets, and so sometimes you have to change the receiver. But 9mm, 38 caliber are within literally of a hair of each other.
The police report did actually name about 7 weapons that there was a possibility they came from. So,
judging by the number of shots, and so you figure your magazine holds a certain number of shots. So based on that, they thought they narrowed it down. Now you guys know they arrested and booked a suspect for Darlene's murder, right? And he had a P-38 on him.
Are you on about those people related to that David Ott?
Well, right. The guy that the night the astronauts were landing on the moon, Ben Villarreal again, and he's supposed to be staking out John Doe Ott. He's supposed to be staking out his house. Well, while he's staking out somebody's house, this guy and his friends show up and they knock on the door and nobody answers, so they leave. So the cops pick them up. Well, the problem is they had no probable cause. If there was nobody home, then they couldn't have bought any drugs. But the cops pick them up anyway, and lo and behold, our friend has a P-38 in his pocket. And here's the interesting thing about that P-38. I talked to that guy. I talked to Donald. He told me, he said, well, I moved there. I was living with my grandma. I was working at Mare Island, but you got to put in your time before you join the union. So I had a lot of time off and money in my pocket, and I fell in bad company, and we're partying. And he's got this drug dealer friend, and we go to his house, and the guy's all paranoid because this guy does business with Sada, blah, 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 blah. Sounds like he's going to go see John Doe Ott. And he says, I was told when they picked me up, I was accused of burglarizing cars. They take me to the police station. And I said, well, you were booked for Darlene's murder. And he said, no. He said, they just told me it was, he said, what I remember was it was carrying a concealed weapon. My grandmother paid my bail and I left town. Well, I don't think he's the killer either. But he would never, and he wouldn't tell me. He would not tell anybody where he got that P-38. And he told me something interesting about it. He said, that gun was broken. I said, what do you mean? He said, the little gadget at the bottom of that pistol grip that holds the magazine in place, he said that gun had been dropped and it broke. So you had to hold the clip in place with duct tape, and sometimes it would jam. And that would explain why the shooting stops at Blue Rock Springs Park. He has to walk back to the headlights and unjam the gun and come back and finish. I think it was the murder weapon. It's obvious from reading the reports. He was set up to get arrested and accused of Darlene's murder, but he would not give up because he had another gun tucked down in his he had an Ivor Johnson tucked down in his underwear. Why was he carrying that P-38? And that P-38 sounds like it's the murder weapon. So Vallejo PD sent it off for ballistics testing to try to match it to the slugs from the Farron murder. That page of the reports has never been seen. Nobody's ever seen what the results are of that test. We don't know if it was a match or not.
It is unusual that it's thought that the killer fired 5 shots, then left and returned and fired four more. But if you listen to George Bryant's statement of the sequence of shots, it's totally different. It doesn't match. Right. So we've got to take with a pinch of salt on whether he's right or whether Majot is correct. After all, he was being shot.
That's right. Also, Mike does change his story a lot. And
that's true, the
letters come out and then he changes his story to match the letters. Well, especially if he knows why he got shot. Like, I think he knows why he got shot. Because he was dressed like a burglar. It was the 4th of July. The whole town was down at the marina watching the boat parades and watching the fireworks. He's going around the neighborhoods, jumping in and out of windows, grabbing radios and things. He worked for his father's pest control service. He knew who left. And in those days, I know you hear old men say this. It's true. We used to leave our doors and windows unlocked. Or if we locked our doors, we didn't lock our windows. And it was so easy for people to jump in and out of windows and see if somebody spots him. He runs around the corner, takes off one shirt, and now his appearance has changed. Yeah. This John Doe Watt, his business plan was these teenagers would bring him stolen goods. Instead of paying them cash, he paid them off in drugs, which he got cheap from his brother in the Hells Angels. And then he fenced the stolen goods. Mike Majot sounds like he was going there to get some, because Darlene was supposed to go get party supplies. Well, she didn't have any money. Where's her money? Her purse was empty. And Mike doesn't have any money. They're going to trade a pillowcase full of stolen radios for a pillowcase full of party supplies. And they think that they've turned snitch. They think that Darlene has turned snitch. Maybe her ex-husband has accused. And this is what happens. I think Richard's right. If Darlene's the target and if cop is the cover, why did they go around to the passenger side of the car? I think they delivered a passenger to Blue Rock Springs Park. That passenger got out of the car, and while
that was Lake Herman where he went up to the passenger side, right, Rich?
No, also Blue Rock Springs Park because at Blue Rock Springs Park he walks up to Mike's side of the car. Yeah. But if there was a third person in the car that Darlene was supposed to take there, and that person got out of the car, that's why the door is open, and the shooting just starts because this is just like what happened to Ronald Leroy, when John Doe Watt decided he was a snitch. I mean, the MO is almost exactly the same, and it's exactly the same as the MO that you see out at Lake Herman Road. So how does that explain why would a cop write these Zodiac letters? Well, it's because in addition to the drug dealing, their parents are also involved in things that this guy's friends in the CIA might have something to say about. Or he might not even know that that's why he's doing it. He's just doing a favor for a friend of his. And maybe that's why he stops writing letters, because he doesn't like what's going on or whatever. It's very hard to say. To this day, I don't know exactly why he did it. But when you look into the backgrounds of the victims, you begin to realize they do have a lot in common, and their parents have everything in common. And it would also explain why, just like Manson, half of the kids in the Manson family had fathers who worked in aerospace. The guy, the security guard who's accused of shooting Bobby Kennedy at the hotel, he worked at Lockheed, right? That was his day job. Yeah. That was his day job.
I talked about that with O'Neill a little bit. So, okay, the Darlene argument outside the restaurant in the parking lot with the supposed man. Where are you guys at on this, Rich? And is this like just Graysmith, doing creative writing, or do we think this is something that actually happened?
Well, You don't know with Graysmith, do you? What's true and what isn't? To be
That's
honest,
why I'm asking.
Is that the one with the car?
If you just read his book and compare it to the files, you can. That's the one. Yeah, yeah. That's the one we're in Graysmith's book. In his book, Graysmith says that Darlene and Mike, that Mike said that they headed towards Mr. Ed's to get something to eat, which is funny because neither one of them had any money. But then when they got close, when they started to pull into Mr. Ed's, they turned around and headed to the park.
Yeah.
Well, there were witnesses who said that they thought they saw an argument between some guys in a van and a car that might have looked something like Darlene's. Now, Graysmith said this argument took place at like 9:30 p.m. or whatever, right before the murder. But I thought it was at the IHOP at the restaurant before she left, like when she got off her shift or whatever. Well, but when you read the police report, it happened at 9:30 a.m., not 9:30 p.m. So that's the kinds of things that Graysmith lies about. Yeah. You know, that because then it implies, it fits his theory that they were followed to Lake Herman Road. They weren't followed there. They were met there. They were met there at straight at midnight. Donald was arrested. He shows up at Willie's house at straight up midnight and gets arrested and booked for the murder briefly for the murder of Darlene Ferrin. You're saying, Rich?
No, I was just saying Darlene did a lot of things that day. So pinpointing any relevance to any particular point in time, hours before the murder, it's impossible to lock down with any relevance.
Agreed. Graysmith changes it to PM so that it looks like that person followed them. It's a pattern, right? Yeah, it's a pattern. Right. Whereas in real life, this incident happened 12 hours earlier. That's what I was getting at. So let's blow the dock for Rich. Essentially, they asked Jim Crabtree on camera if he is the killer of Darlene. He says no. His alibi is that he was on an acid trip. Was it Boulder Canyon, Boulder Creek, something like that? Yeah, Boulder Creek. He claims Santa Cruz. Yeah. He claims he went on an acid trip voyage there, and a family was cooking out, and he waved to him, and was it a federal judge, Tom? And he claimed it was a federal judge. Yeah. That apparently was his alibi. Now here's where it gets real weird, Rich. He says, then they started looking at me as the Zodiac because I was a cryptographer expert in the military and I had a bunch of magic books in my house. So this just comes back to like every person ever saying, oh my God, they looked at my background as a fit from the Zodiac. And that's when his story kind of started falling apart for me. I just like, first of all, why would you even say that, if that's your ex-wife,
Did they track down the eyewitnesses to verify his story?
No. Tom? No. Here's the thing. Here's something else you need to know. Jim was never married to Darlene. Okay. Jim has he supposedly had a wife and baby in Germany, but he just left them there and never divorced them. He supposedly married a girl named Shirley after he broke up with Darlene, and she was pregnant at the time Darlene was killed. None of that's true. Jim Crabtree only ever married one woman, and her father was a wealthy doctor, apparently an abortionist, probably part of George Hodell's abortion ring, apparently. And he's the one who paid for that house. He paid 11,000 American dollars in 1969. That's like $300,000 for a house today. Paid cash for a house for Jim and Kathleen to live in. Now, Pops, the pregnant girl was supposedly named Shirley, and she's listed in the police report as Jim's common law wife, that they're not legally married, because he was legally married to Kathleen Stanton. And that's the only woman he's ever been legally married to that I can find. He's not married to Sonny now, and he was never married to Darlene. So I thought, and they showed it. I guess they found a copy of the certificate, but apparently he had forged. And it's not the same thing as you can forge these things. Like I've seen them all, phony marriage certificates that he showed or gave to Darlene's parents, but there is no record of their marriage and there is no record of their divorce. Wow.
And there's no proof he was at Blue Rock Springs that night.
No, that's true. Yeah. But the general description that Mike gave does resemble Jim. Number two, he said that the killer drove a car similar or even identical to Darlene's brown Corvair. Jim owned an identical 1963 brown Corvair. He admitted it to police, but he claimed he got rid of it.
Match the description how, Tom, though, because didn't he say round face, glasses? That I thought Jim was like a skinny, kind of not looking like that dude.
Well, if you look at that picture of him with Darlene, he's got a little pot belly. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying I can prove conclusively he was the guy that Mike saw, but he does have a motive. He's had a history of violence against women. He's suspected in murdering other women, etc. He's a bullshit, and he constantly drops hints that he is Zodiac. He's a bullshit artist, but there may be a kernel of truth to that. He could easily have been an Operation Chaos COINTELPRO Mockingbird agent, because to this very day, he and Sonny cover this left we call them pretendians. They pretend to be interested in Native American culture, but it's all phony. Mm-hmm. He's really into that. And that's Operation Mockingbird had a lot of people in that, like, Barry DeCinco and people like that.
I can see that.
People. He knew those people.
He's definitely not Zodiac. He's definitely not Zodiac, though, 100%.
But now his handwriting doesn't match the letters, but he sure makes a good suspect in some of those other. It's just funny. He happens to be around when these other murders happen. And Doreen Gall, who might be, maybe she and Jim Sharp, these two Scientologists, murdered in Los Angeles in the summer of '69, right before the Zodiac starts. Well, she's from Albany, New York.
Wow.
And her father, you dig into these backgrounds, a whole bunch of people, like I looked up every name in Jim's address book, and then Darlene has it at the time of her death, and the latest entries are in Darlene's handwriting. I think that might have actually been the motive for her murder. There are pages missing from it, and like I said, when you research the names in it, like when the cops did not find Stein's waybill. They backtracked the notches on his meter, tried to figure out where he was. Yeah. Well, according to Keith Power's article in the Chronicle, he says according to the waybill that the cops never found, that he picked up the killer in front of the Pinecrest at Mason and Geary. But the cops thought it was 4 blocks further away, and they just assumed it was the Fairmont on top of Nob Hill because they had this taxi cab bandit who was doing the same thing. Yeah. But instead of going 4 blocks north on Nob Hill, if you go 4 blocks further east, that's 10 Geary Street. That's Darlene's Uncle Frank's coffee shop.
Did you know that letter associated with Doreen Gall, the Zodiac letter?
No, not really. Go ahead. I may have seen it once, but
allegedly there was that letter with the little beads at the bottom, or it looks like a little few. You know what I mean, don't you, Ross?
I think so. So I was going to ask you about the 13 hole.
Well, there was a letter found in Doreen Gall's possessions, signed the Zodiac Killer. Now, Doreen Gall lived in Bonnie Bray Street, and there was a taxi cab murder in Bonnie Bray Street in 1954.
Wow, that's bugged, man. You guys are going wild.
Bit of a distance between them, I know, but it's just a little one of those silly.
So anyway, long before I ever cared the slightest about Zodiac, to make a long story short, I've done a lot of research in KGB operations in America that's been totally overlooked. I mean, there were thousands of KGB agents living full-time in America. There has been a documentary about a few of their kids, because you don't tell your kids you're a spy. So researching that material, I knew about, for example, a KGB. She might not have known she worked for the KGB, but she knew she worked for the QLF, the Quebec Liberation Front. And this information is being passed along to the KGB. She worked in the state government in Albany, New York. Well, her mother worked at the New York Telephone Company. And then her father had worked at the New York Telephone Company. And then he goes to work at Bendix. And then he goes to work at the National Signal Laboratories, which I keep bringing up and bringing up and bringing up. A whole bunch of these people, and some of them, like Eunice Nolan, worked at the telephone company where apparently Darlene worked. That's why they moved to Albany, because AT&T transferred her to Albany.
By AT&T.
Right. And so there's the telephone company link to Darlene. People have this, and Jim does this. Jim and the cops who didn't solve Darlene's murder, they're always dragging her through the mud. Oh, she was a tramp. blah, blah. She was on drugs. If you look at her handwriting, this is the handwriting of an organized, intelligent person with her shit together. That's why she's such a good waitress. You have to be that way. But she starts off working at the phone company. And so you get this wrong idea about Darlene. And really, she's tarred with Jim's brush. Oh, she met Jim in some hippie bar or something. I don't think so. I think they were into
Ashbury.
So if you come back to this picture of Darlene with the unknown man in the house of the Nazi who supposedly, and maybe he owned the house and rented it to the doctor. Maybe that's true.
Yeah.
But that guy in that picture turns out to look exactly like Jim's older brother, Otis. Like that might be a picture of Otis with Darlene. And Otis is the one who apparently worked with Josephine Bates's father.
So you guys had Darlene's current husband at the time, the cook at the restaurant, and Dean was saying that he didn't believe that false narrative of how Darlene is painted with that brush as a bad person.
Right.
I'm gonna wrap us soon, guys. We're over 2:20.
Wow.
Drew went by fast, right? Drew gave me a tip that Andrew Knox gave him. He said that they thought the letter writers read a play called The Devil's Charter. Have you heard of this, Rich?
The Devil's Charter.
Oh, the Jacobite references was that in the article? Okay. The French. Yeah. So Richard, this was the French. They're at the Sorbonne University. They're linguists. They're computational linguists. They're the ones who identified Q from the language. So they said, as far as they could see, they do see a shift in person writing letters, Zodiac letters, beginning with the Stein letter, which there's other doubts about. So that was one of their conclusions. Another one was they said they thought they found a lot of obscure references to Jacobite poems and plays, which is interesting because this ring of spies I'm talking about, going all the way back to the American Civil War, going all the way back to the American Revolution, a bunch of them are Jacobites or Freemasons associated with the Jacobites.
Which I always wondered about Mason and Geary, if Mason and Geary is a reference to Freemasonry. I know that's completely,
The whole city of San Francisco was laid out by a city planner who deliberately laid it out as a Masonic city. And
much like Boston.
Oh, right. Because those generation of these colonists fleeing England, they're persecuted. Freemasons are dissenters. They're free thinkers. They're probably Gnostic Christians. They are not Church of England people. They flee and come to New England to establish a Masonic republic. The Stanfords, the Folgers, the Perkins, the Cabots, the Lodges, they're all Freemasons. They're all Scottish Freemasons after they kind of merged with apparently some Jacobites. I have an ancestor, Macomb, who was captured at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1679, fighting with the Irish Jacobite. He was an Irish Jacobite, if you can believe such a thing. And their punishment was, this is pre-Australia days, their punishment was, instead of being executed, they were transported to America. And he's dumped.
Fate worse than death, Rich.
Well, it was hard. It was kind of hard.
Didn't say that.
and so we keep finding these references, and these linguists think they find references to, and isn't even the Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan, aren't there some kind of
there's a Gilbert and Sullivan rendition of it, but
right, yeah. So
yeah, there's a lot about the Mikado.
That was interesting that they found the Jacobite references, but that fits in with this huge conspiracy theory of mine that starts with realizing that the Zodiac killer was not a serial killer acting alone. That's not what happened at all.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting thing to look up, Thomas, and I may have told this to Ross before, when you said there's no physical evidence linking one crime to another.
Right.
Did you ever see the 1995 Great Crimes and Trials from BBC? I think it was from BBC Two, but it was on the A&E network in America.
Probably not. I didn't care about Zodiac until about 2010.
I don't think I've heard of that one.
Well, I think I've told you this, Ross, when you look at, I mean, usually newspaper reports exaggerate or get things wrong. They might say Cecilia was stabbed 24 times, Brian 12 or 14. They usually
Sherry 42.
Facts and they distort them. But what they don't usually do is pull new facts never said before out of complete thin air. If you look at this documentary, it said when the letter arrived, the Stein letter, October the 14th, when it arrived, in it contained a bullet. It contained a bullet from the same pistol that killed Faraday and Jensen. And I found that really interesting. You know why I find it interesting? Because there's a missing bullet in the DOJ report. There's only 4 listed in the DOJ report as coming from Betty Lou Jensen. One is missing, and that's one from the turnout. The same way as they lost the painting.
There's one that glanced off. One that glanced off the top of the car, and one where he may have missed.
But he could have easily taken one of the bullets that he shot.
Yeah,
and then put it in the letter, in the Stein letter. Because if you remember the opening of that letter, it said, "Here's a bloodstained piece of the shirt to prove I am the killer," sort of thing. The next line is, "I was also responsible for the people in the North Bay area." Wouldn't it be just ironical to link that to
that would be crazy.
With a bullet?
And what happened to this magic disappearing bullet is all I'm saying.
Well, that's what I'm saysaying. Did they not release
According
it?
to you, Snook pocketed it.
There is no other. There is no. Well, number one, the book is limited to the same information that was available to Graysmith when he wrote his book. So that's number one. And then the middle section of it, you can skip the first time through. It's just about the history of vigilante journalism in San Francisco and blah, 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 blah. That was the original academic work I was working on. Then I go through the reports and nothing but the reports. What do they tell us that we know as a fact compared to what assumptions we can make? And what does that tell us about each murder? One thing that's really interesting is police at the time did have very good suspects in every one of these murders. And apparently the only reason some of these people were not charged with murder is because the Zodiac letters gave them an alibi, accidentally or intentionally. So that was kind of funny. There were suspects in every murder. Two, there not only is there no piece of evidence that links any 2 murders, things like fingerprints and witness descriptions tend to rule out even a possibility of a single killer. There's just no way one person did all that. I mean,
unless he mailed that shell,
but
like Rich just said, unless he mailed in that shell, like Rich just said.
Well, that's a big F. But then the letters, when you realize that the person writing the letters also had access to the reports, at least some of them, that's a short list of people, especially in that time frame.
That's a big if too. That's a big if too, Tom.
No, there's no if to it because the envelopes are addressed "Attention, Deputy Snook." I mean, they're sent to him. See, that's one of the lies. One of the lies in Graysmith's book is that the police departments weren't cooperating. That's not just a lie. It's kind of part of how the whole thing got rolling, because Mel Nikolai had already instituted this program so that police departments would routinely share information on unsolved homicides. And the designated person at Napa to receive and coordinate those files was Hal Snook. Also, at one point in the Farron investigation, deputies drive to Napa County to interview a suspect. So they are sharing information. And Hal Snook has access to that information. And he knows everything about how a newspaper works, because he's run several newspapers. He knows everything about, and on top of everything else, his handwriting is a perfect match. Especially those first 4 Zodiac letters. I don't see how there's any way around it. He wrote those letters, and he had I can prove with his military records, he really did have cryptography training, aerial navigation training. He trained jungle fighters and how to build roadside bombs. He had some of the misspelled letters in the Zodiac letters aren't misspelled. They're chemical names. Analate is a chemical process. Serous oxalate is a chemical used as invisible ink. It's used before Dramamine. It was given to paratroopers and sailors to fight air sickness and seasickness. And it's used to polish gems and rocks. And that was Hal's hobby. And he learned that hobby from a newspaper publisher up north of Napa, and I think it's Clear Lake or Lake City, where the daughter of the man who taught him, who helped him with his newspaper business and taught him how to polish rocks, she was murdered in a bizarre murder that includes, and I'm not making this up, the Visalia ransacker. And it turns out that Paul Stein grew up in a town called Exeter, California, where the Visalia ransacker was active, and Paul Stein was a cub reporter at the time. And this is where the Golden State Killer supposedly first starts. And the funny thing is, the Golden State Killer supposedly tried to frame certain people for his crimes. And one of those guys is named Oscar. I'll think of it in just a second. A childhood friend and high school buddy of Paul Stein's, Oscar Clifton, who did murder his wife, but apparently was framed for being the Golden State Killer, whom Paul Stein might have known and the Visalia ransacker apparently, like, it stops, and nobody really knows for sure if it's directly linked to the Golden State Killer or the Golden State Rapist, but it's going on at the same time in the same town where Jim Crabtree's parents used to live. But so they're living there, and where
this is a long stretch, Tom. Keep going.
At this time, do you know who else is living in that town at the same time, the early 60s?
No.
Rodney Alcala.
Oh, the game show killer.
Rodrigo Alcala Bucor. His father was a Mexican citizen, but he taught English and Spanish on both sides of the border. They were living in Visalia. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Visalia ransacker had a very, very specific MO. He never really covered up the fact that he'd been in your house. You would come home and you'd have a window open and maybe a ladder up against the house. You go in your house and look around. Somebody has gone through your stuff.
Didn't he eat food out of the fridge?
They didn't steal anything valuable, but maybe your hairbrush is missing or a little keepsake picture is missing. This was the Visalia ransacker. Well, several years later, this lady gets murdered in Clear Lake. It's Lake County. It's just north of Napa. This woman gets murdered. Well, there had been a ransacker active in that town for several months. And his MO was he never tried to cover up the fact he was in your house. And like, this lady lived alone in a house, and she had come home 3 times. She had been ransacked by this guy. And one time he left the ladder up against the house. Well, it turned out that the ransacker, who might not have murdered her, it turns out that ransacker was an employee of Pacific Gas and Electric, and he had been transferred from further south, the middle, what they call the Inland Empire of California, and had been transferred to this county north of Napa County because he had been caught ransacking people's houses down south. And the only reason I bring it up is, you know what Colonel Jensen did for a living, right? Betty Lou Jensen's father. You know what he did?
I don't know.
He was a manager at Pacific Gas and Electric.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he got that job because when he was in the U.S. Army, he worked at a chemical weapons facility outside of Colorado Springs, Colorado, where he learned about all the gas line procedures, like for napalm. And so he gets.
You're talking about being crack proof and pipe stress analysis.
I don't know about that, but I do know.
Well, that's Drew's angle on Sheeny, that he understood pipe engineering. So when Zodiac says I am crack proof, it's a pipe stress analysis terminology.
And that would bring in Colonel Jensen. And once again, he's involved in at least secret work, because like Pacific Gas and Electric would need managers who, in case of war,
radians are used by pipe stress analysis, Richard. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And so you start to see there are links between these cases. And then Hal Snook, you start coming up with different names again and again and again. Jim Crabtree, Hal Snook. You just keep coming up with these. And of course, that could bring in Arthur Lee Allen. There's no way Arthur Lee Allen didn't know Dennis Land. Dennis Land was gay. Arthur Lee Allen was gay and a pedophile. They're both avid outdoorsmen. They both spend their spare time at Lake Berryessa. Don't tell me they're not friends. And the funny thing is, Dennis Land's brother Raymond could pass for Arthur Lee Allen. They look so much alike.
Well, when we have round 2, I'll put a link to you. Well, I'll show you a link, whether you believe it or not, between the letters from 69 through to 71 through the Snoozy and Furlong murders.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You are the first person since Evan from Texas. Now, listen, the guys at Peacock, Andrew and those guys, they read my book, took it seriously. Now, they've gone beyond the book. They just start with this idea, maybe there's multiple killers and maybe that. So, give them a break. They got people to talk to it. They got Crabtree to talk. They got Linda Jensen to talk, who's terrified of talking. And I wish I could tell her the guy was dead, but Crabtree's not dead. I'm not, but whatever. What I'm saying is, Richard, it was such a pleasure to meet you. Please find that analysis of which letters the cop was talking about, because you were absolutely right. Which letters were licked and which letters were not licked. Please find that, because it's priceless. And I'm telling you, you're right on the ball. And just like all that other stuff you brought up is right on the ball.
It was on my 78 page. I've deleted it, I think, but I do remember what I wrote. So
here's the thing, Rich. Like, for the letters that are licked, then why isn't that a dead to rights shot on the DNA analysis? Is it because it's so degraded that it only shows that it was licked and it doesn't complete a full profile?
Right.
That's a possibility. Yeah, of course. I mean,
gotcha. What they found was when they analyzed the glue on the envelopes and stamps, they were looking under a microscope. They're looking for individual buccal cells or cells of the tongue or the cheek that would be in your saliva. Yeah. Because those would have a good chance of being maybe the DNA was still intact. Yeah. So when they did that work, the cop who presented the results said, among other things, he said, the authentic Zodiac letters, we didn't really find hardly any cells. And because those envelopes and stamps apparently weren't licked, the guy apparently used a sponge, which would be a smart thing to do, because even before DNA, they could get your blood type, and they could also, there were certain proteins that could narrow it down, like 1 in 1,000. So the guy was smart enough to do that. Suddenly, the later letters this cop refers to, they find a lot more cells, which indicates that these were licked, which indicates a change in method, which suggests a different letter writer, but those cells did not produce enough useful DNA, right, Richard? Like at the time, this is like 20 years ago or whatever, right?
Yeah, the later letters supposedly had more on them, but
right, which would suggest that the letters were licked, which does suggest a change in method. And then I can show you a very distinctive change in the hand, like it's blatantly obvious it's a different handwriting.
Maybe. You were saying, Rich?
Mike Rodelli quoted the guy who did the testing, who said the 78 letter matched one of the 74 letters.
Nice.
And Mike Rodelli argues that's the Exorcist letter, therefore that the 78 letter is a hoax and so is the Exorcist letter. But as I've shown, the envelope from the Exorcist letter is perfectly matched to the dragon card. Therefore, if Mike Rodelli contests that 78 letter it can't be a hoax, because if it matches the DNA from the Exorcist letter, which was the only one in that DNA list, then both have to be genuine.
See what I mean? Richard figured all this out. And I'm telling you, the handwriting and the style and the subject matter of the Exorcist letter does match other letters that we found that Hal Snook wrote to other newspapers that had nothing to do with Zodiac. He just liked writing smart-ass letters to editors because he'd been one.
For sure. Mike Rodelli, if you want to come up next, get at me. With that, gents, I'm going to wrap. We're over 2.5 hours. The documentary is Myth of the Zodiac, out now, episode 1 and 2 on Peacock. The book is also Myth of the Zodiac Killer by this man here. If you want to see Zodiacologists get triggered, recommend that they read this. It's absolutely hilarious when they melt down. Richard Grinell, ZodiacCiphers.com, one of the best in the game.
Yeah. Nice speaking to you both.
Hope you enjoyed.
Richard, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. I've got some stuff I can send you too about like that typewriter, identifying that typewriter and all that other stuff. So
I put you guys both on email in the last email. So
Richard, I'll get you your promo code for a free subscription to my website. Are you already subscribed? You've been watching
No, I don't think so. No.
Yeah, I'll just send you. I'll get you a way to get the book and get you subscribed to the website, so you can see the most recent videos, because I've gone way beyond the book and way beyond the documentary that's on Peacock. I think they tried to leave it they're leaving it open for a season 2 because they know that there's all this other stuff that comes out. But your work has just been so above everybody else that has really looked at the letters. You've just done fantastic work.
And then we can have round 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on my show. Yeah, come on my show. Yeah, totally. For sure.
I mean, yeah, we got to get the gang back together, Prof. And
we got to do that too. We got to listen to that episode of May Brussels.
Yeah, and get Rich on with us because I go ahead, Rich.
It'd be nice to get Drewser as well. I've never spoken to him.
He's really good. He does a show with the other guys that's amazing. They do all different cases.
Yeah, he's helped me no end.
No kidding. Drew Beeson has cracked DB Cooper. There's no doubt about that.
No, I meant Drewser, but yeah.
Drewser's another dude, yeah. See, what I do, Prof, is the Z pre-crimes, the pre-canonicals, but what Rich was talking about is actually a post-canonical. That's when he threatens that teacher and breaks into his house and poisons him with the arsenic or whatever it was, Rich. And I'm totally in agreement with Rich that I think I like Z for that. So it seems that activity is still going on. But anyway, that was episode 7. Zodiac Files interview. Zodiac Files episode 4 is coming soon, by the way. The Gavita Beach murders. I got a lot of new reveals on that one. You guys are gonna like that. So
yeah, and that like those other, we did an episode. So it's not that the whole thing was a joke. No, it's that it's more complicated than you thought, and it actually fits in with all this stuff that Rich and Ross and Drew had dug up. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thanks very much, Ross. And
thank you very much, guys.
I'll catch you both soon.
Thanks for joining us. I'm going to, I'll drop you guys. Get at me. We'll be talking soon.
Okay,
appreciate you guys' time. Folks. Great show, brothers. Everybody like, sub, share. Follow these guys everywhere on the internet. Tom, your website, thomashenryhoran.com. Is that where they subscribe?
Yeah, there's several. thomashenryhoran.com, the Stones Unturned podcast.com, or if you just search Myth of the Zodiac Killer.com, it takes you to my website.
So that's where you have it, folks. Thanks for joining us, boys. I'm going to do the outro. Get at me.
Cheerio.
Appreciate you guys. Cheers. Prof, you're the man.
Are you going to hang up on me or do I hang up on you?
I can drop you. You're good. Yeah. You know how this thing goes.
I'll see you.
Appreciate you, sir. Have a good one. Congrats on the doc.
Oh, thank you so much.
Have a good one, sir. I got it. My boy Rick wants to get you on too. I'll email you about it.
Oh yeah, I'll do any podcast.
Yeah. He wants to do Z and SOS with you, Son of Sam. So
I'm hopefully going to be on Jimmy Fallon Gong pretty soon too. So
hell yeah. Follow Tom everywhere, guys. Prof. Thank you, sir. All right, guys. There you have it. Myth of the Zodiac out now. Peacock episode 1 and 2. Like, shove, share. Shout out to everybody who came through. French Wrecking Crew. Our boy Jerome, Drew, Steven, everybody else who came through. Wall Street. It's a poppin' show. Go get the comic book. It is The Dark Rift Volume 1 out now on Amazon. That is the first Planet X comic. And then Zodiac Files episode 4 is coming soon. The Gavita Beach murders. If you know about Dominguez Edwards' murder of 1963, it's going to be a super in-depth deep dive shot on site in Santa Barbara. That's coming real soon. Like, sub, share. That's all I got for you. This is our longest episode, almost 3 hours. Give me some subs. We're out.